Morning, everybody. Hope you all had a great weekend. We will start going. I've seen the number of participants is still, people are still logging in, but not quite the fast and furious pace they were a couple minutes ago. So we'll go ahead and get started for the day. I want to thank you all for making time. Many of you spent a very long day on Tuesday with us last week, hearing from some experts on various areas around school reopening challenges and information that folks had and recommendations and some actions that other institutions were taking locally and nationally and internationally. So hopefully between then and now, you've sort of started to assimilate your thoughts around some of that. And of course, most importantly, everything that's happening in your local schools and your local communities. I know that some of you are at all different stages in the process right now of sort of doing your reopening plans. So we hope that this conversation can be helpful today for everybody. And that's exactly what we want today to be, is a conversation. To the extent that you're all comfortable, if that any of you are comfortable doing so, we'd love to see your faces. We know that's not possible for everybody, but I think it would help promote a conversational culture here. We've got three topics today. First one from 9 to 10, second one from 10 to 11:30, third one 11:30 to 12:30. I didn't add any purposeful breaks in there, but we'll try to end every session at least 5 minutes early and start the next session maybe 2-3 minutes out, so everyone can grab some water or coffee, hit the restroom if they need to, between each session. So we will not go back to back to back to back to back. I don't think I can sit still for that many minutes at a time either. With that, feel free to use the chat box if you want to throw in a question if folks are in the middle of chatting. But also, the group is not enormous today, 40 folks right now. So if you just want to unmute yourself and yell out a question if you have one, I think we can handle that too. If it somehow gets crazy, we can change it up. But we really do want this time to be useful to you. So to that end, for each session, we've gathered 1 to 4 school leaders plus an authorizer representative to sort of talk through a few key questions from their perspective, what's happening in their schools. But we are not counting on them to be like the experts that have the exact answers that everybody is going to use for their situations. It's just sort of a point for us to get the conversations flowing. And authorizers are here to help to help me moderate, to help think of questions that I'm not going to think of, because they are talking to a lot of you on a daily basis. They also might know give some great examples of what some of the schools that aren't represented here today might be doing that they know about. So with that said, we will jump into our first session. So this session is meant to chat mostly about what you all are doing this summer specifically. How you're doing enrollment, how you're doing family engagement, how you're ensuring the families that have signed up, have been with you for years, actually show up in the fall, all with the challenging environment of not being able to, hold typical events or, do things the way you've done them in the past. We've got 2 lovely ladies with us today, both career educators. Kelly Marshall's the Chief Academic Officer with the GEO Academies, which currently have schools in Gary and and hopefully school and opening this fall in Indianapolis. And I don't know, Kelly, you can tell us if you're also, I don't know if you're the Chief Academic Officer for the Louisiana schools too. You might be.
No, no, that is a wonderful lady by the name of Sandra Douglas.
And a lot of you know Kelly from her previous work, a longtime member of the Tinley Schools family, and before that, IPS. Lindsay Omlor is the executive director, I believe, of charter schools at Education One, which is the authorizing agency that's associated with Trine University. They have schools, their portfolio includes schools in Gary, in Fort Wayne, in South Bend, and one in Indianapolis too. And Lindsay, also a career educator, a lot of her time spent in charter schools prior to becoming an authorizer. So with that, ladies, you can join us, unmute yourselves. And I'm just going to kick it off with a question for Kelly, just kind of the major thing that I talked about. Kelly, can you tell us how you're addressing enrollment this summer at your various schools? Since you can't do things the typical way, we've heard that a lot of schools are below enrollment from where they were this time last year and in this time in typical other years, because parents are just sort of waiting to see what's going on. So we just love to hear from your viewpoint how things are going, what you're doing differently, and if you're able to do anything similarly to the past.
So thank you. First of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. Marcy, no, nothing has been the same. I have become more involved with social media than I ever thought I would have. And you know, much of what we're doing here at GEO is not any different than anyone else. I think what has been truly successful for us, though, are the opportunities to get our partners online with us. And so we started off where it was just going to be, you know, Kelly talking about GEO. And that was great as long as, you know, my communication lasted and people knew who the heck Kelly was. But then we had the idea that, you know what, there are a lot of great schools out there in Indianapolis. We are asking to get their kids, so why don't we go ahead and partner with our feeder schools? So we are, every Saturday morning, we are on with Harambe Radio on AM 1310, and I was talking with Dr. Thomas Brown, and I said, you know what, why don't I see if I can go ahead and also get some of our partners to start joining us? And so we had what's Crystal Westerhouse from Avondale Meadows come on to the radio show. And I said, well, you know what? Let's go ahead and take that also to Facebook Live. So we had Megan Murphy on with Facebook Live. We've had representatives from Andrew J. Brown, Paramount, and then it started to spark more of a conversation with the social media, like these Facebook Live events. So we are partnered with Spur as our marketing firm. And each time we put an ad out or whatever, we're then going back to look at the analytics to see who's logging on. So we started to find out that a lot of our alum were logging on. Well, some of our alum at GEO are connected to families. So we said, you know what? Let's get some alum on. So then that sparked us to then have two of our former students from GEO on. And so we're going to pick up with that. And I think we're just letting the data drive us based upon comments, based upon zip codes that are logging on, genders, age groups that are logging on, and we're just moving with that. But it is completely different. So as much as I appreciate the data, that's how frustrated I am with social media, but I have to live in it.
Well, I mean, that's not just social media. You're talking about pretty, traditional media. If you're doing radio shows every week,
we did radio as well. Yes.
Yeah. Are you finding that some of these media that you're using are working better in Gary versus Indy or elsewise, or for recruiting at the elementary level versus the high school versus the adult high school level, which you all have too? Are there any differences there?
So it's actually from city to city. So because Gary's established, it's still word of mouth. And so we are doing better with our recruitment just by talking with our parents who know other parents. Here in Indy, even though I've been around for a while, to launch a school, that's where I've got to be more strategic with how I'm getting the message out there. Facebook has been the key. People are logging on to Facebook. I've not had as much, as many hits or whatever on the other platforms, Instagram, things like that, but it also could be my style. I know that there are other school leaders out there where Instagram is how they're getting all their people. LinkedIn is how they're getting all their people. Our families are tending to live more in Facebook. And in Gary, it's word of mouth.
Interesting. Are you finding that to be more challenging than usual, given that mouth to mouth and face to face is more challenging currently?
Absolutely. And so we've been living through our teachers and living through our leaders. And so, we're all sending, the updates to families. We're all sending, emails, texts, everything I think I would have encouraged a teacher to stray away from is what we're having to do now. text your parents, and parents then text other parents. I would say one of our challenges right now is our kindergarten. You're used to having the buildings open so that parents can come through. For parents where this is their first, opportunity with school, that's where it's become more challenging.
I've certainly heard that from many schools. Lindsay, have you as well?
Absolutely. I think our schools are still hanging on to a thread of hope that closer to the start of school, they'll be able to do some sort of a meet and greet for kindergarten families, whether that's kindergarten roundup or what that looks like. Maybe it's different, but I think they are definitely challenged in finding those new students who don't have an older sibling who's just going to naturally matriculate into the school, and then figuring out how to really engage with those families and really show them their programming in a way that's going to make parents who are bringing kids to school for the first time comfortable in their choice. That's certainly been a struggle in our schools as well. Just to kind of piggyback off something that Kelly mentioned, I think obviously depending on the area of the state that you're in, our schools have seen a lot of success with just making those connections with families. And I think a lot of what's going to really help their students return to them in the fall, or has encouraged them to reach out to new families and enroll in our schools, has been just the way that our schools are trying to take a holistic approach to serving families throughout this pandemic. So yes, social media has been a big thing for them, but they're really trying to serve families and every one of their needs, not just academic needs, but really looking at how can we provide school supplies for families throughout this time? How can we provide food and meals for families throughout this time? And our families are noticing that and they're appreciating it. And it's not just the families that we have enrolled, but the community, really. Many of our schools have served food to families that are just in the community, whether they've been students or not. And the community is taking note of that. And that's been really just meeting those holistic needs of the entire family, I think has been really helpful for our schools.
So pivoting a little bit, how are you engaging families that are enrolled, or your families that have been with you for a while, Kelly? Is it the social media too? Are you able to find ways to have them gathered to kind of spread your culture, so to speak, before the school year starts? Or is that just something that just sort of has to take a backseat this summer?
No, we're living through that virtual world. I mean, to Lindsay's point as well, just connecting with families during, food distributions, things like that. Our enrolled families have become more involved. And now I'm going to speak to Indianapolis first. Our enrolled families have become more involved with the recruitment as well. Because I think they see the challenges that we're having and, trying to engage them, dropping off welcome boxes, just walking through their neighborhoods. We literally spent Saturday walking through the neighborhoods, talking with our parents, again, practicing social distancing, but letting them know that we're there. In Gary, it has been, just living through the teachers. What do you need? We've got a call center set up that we put in place during the initial closure that was initially set up to reach those hard to reach families. But we've kept that call center going just to make sure that there are consistent check-ins happening. So any of our staff that are still 12-month employees are engaging with those families consistently just to check in. When you go through the school year, which families may be in more need. And so they're getting increased touch points with, home visits and things like that. Again, masks and gloves and all, but still just staying accessible to them.
Is that call center for families to call you with questions and concerns, or are you having folks proactively just reach out to families?
It's both. We have a call center set up so that if parents are in need and is a resource that we can offer, we can at least, leverage who we have and still on staff as a 12-month employee to get them some resources. And it's also those families that we just know we've got a running list that we just continue to check in.
I think too, our schools are a lot of this is really going back. I mean, Kelly hit the nail on the head. First and foremost, everyone's using social media to really kind of target families. But one of the things, our schools have really gone back to a lot of grassroots efforts. And so it's going back to postcard mailers, it's going back to radio, but also asking our families to put yard signs in their yards, which they've been willing to do, to sort of spread that word of mouth and hopefully recruit new families just by seeing a yard sign when they're driving by their neighborhood. So a lot of just grassroots efforts, whether it's going door to door or just having those phone calls with family, but just trying to get the word out there in a different and unique way, and supporting communities throughout this time.
Is anyone on the Zoom, I keep wanting to say call, using similar techniques like that, like yard signs, radio, postcards, kind of the more old-fashioned things, and finding success with those? No, I'm seeing some heads shaking no.
I would say we probably really don't know exactly what the success looked like until school starts, right? We're doing all our hard work in adjusting to the uncertainties, and we've used some of the same tactics as I see as Kelly Marshall has talked through, but unfortunately, this is new territory for us all. And so we won't know exactly what works and what's not working until the first day of school, or at least until the first week. And then we could go back to the drawing table and start all over again.
I sort of skipped over this point, but I feel like it might be a point for conversation. Are a lot of other schools, I think I've heard this anecdotally, but I don't know if it's true across the board, seeing their biggest challenge at the kindergarten and maybe even first grade levels as well? Enrollment wise, I should say. Not sure I'm seeing anybody. Anyone else willing to jump in on that point?
Yeah, I can. Lonnie from Pilot Ed here.
What do you think, Lonnie?
Yeah, so for us, kindergarten has been a challenge because we talked about earlier, we can't go to the preschools and try to recruit kids from there. But in the past, we were able to do some sort of like a table, and they have these kindergarten roundup days that we would participate in, but we can't do that anymore. So instead this year, we're just like everybody else relying on Facebook and radio ads and yard signs. We put out a lot of yard signs this year because we had a lot more time, and we were able to cover more areas. But based on the data that we've received on those who have applied, the parents haven't really been driving. They have been spending more time on their phones and less in traffic. So most of our new applicants are actually from social media instead of the traditional yard signs that we have out there.
That's helpful, Lonnie. Is anyone actually hearing directly from parents like, I would have been interested in your school, but this year I'm just gonna skip kindergarten this year? Is anyone saying flat out like it's a no for me? Or are they just sort of in the space where they're a little nervous and they just aren't sure yet?
Not for us. Our parents are eager to get their kids out there to school. Our parents who are concerned are still saying, you know what, we would rather put our kids in school because we are essential workers. Most of our parents need to be working, so they have to put their kids somewhere.
I think,
Go ahead, Lindsay.
just to kind of piggyback off what she's saying, I think our schools have been seeing 50-50, right? So we have families who are saying the same exact thing. They're essential workers. They're ready to get back to normal. They need their kids in school. But then we also have a handful of families at our schools who are saying, we've enjoyed this time at home with our families, or we're feeling really anxious about what the fall looks like, and aren't necessarily ready to send our kids back to school in a traditional model. And I think for that reason, I mean, we ultimately have ended up authorizing a virtual school that's going to open in the fall. And it's for this exact reason, right? For those families who are still feeling leery about COVID, who aren't necessarily ready to return to a traditional setting. And so I think we're seeing both, but our schools have been really intentional with sending out parent surveys. And like I said, just making continuous contact with their families to really hear from parents and to really collect that data to be able to then drive what they're doing next.
I just chatting here with Peg right out on the chat, and she's with the Geist Montessori. She's saying that they're doing summer tutoring with some struggling families to help ensure they return. I'm not sure if that's a strategy that you all are doing, purposeful outreach to families who, you know, you're kind of unsure, they may or may not be on the fence about, will you see them again? Kelly, are you guys able to do anything like that?
So we're not doing the virtual tutoring. We have been more intentional with, well, I guess it is virtual tutoring, but it's more of engaging the families with how to maneuver through the social media platforms. So our schools in Gary, you know, we knew that all of our classrooms were living in Google Classroom. We're living in Zoom meetings, but we had realized quickly on that our parents didn't have, you know, they had not been living in that world. And so as soon as teachers were trained, we took the initiative and are continuing to take the initiative to offer resources to families to learn those platforms, because we're planning for both. You know, I think everyone on the call knows that we were all waiting on that guidance from the state as to how we, you know, what we should do to open back up. And, you know, now that we have that, I don't think there's anyone on the call who's not planning for both the physical return and the virtual return. And so the best way to keep those families engaged and knowing how to be as best support to their student is to then offer the tutoring in that area. So that's what the tutoring looks like. It's more for the parents. How do you maneuver through the virtual platforms that inevitably schools are going to be using now?
That's actually really interesting. Are you finding some success there? Or are people just like, I'm still?
No, it's at the elementary level. So at the elementary level in Gary, we had like a tremendous turnout, right? Secondary, not so much. You know, it's an understanding that, oh, my kid will figure that out. But especially our primary grades, those parents were logged right on because, you know, for the longest they had lived in, you know, Classroom Dojo. And so now we're going to switch to Google Classroom and all that. So when the school year ended, you know, parents wanted to know, are you going to continue using this? Yes, we are. Log on and let's get a training. And so that's been successful for us to know that we need to do it again.
Great.
I think it's interesting too, Marcy, to hear just from new schools, anybody who's in startup this year, or even schools like, for example, I see one of my principals is on from Dynamic Minds Academy, CMU BND, and this was her school's first year. So they went through startup of a brand new school, and then midway through the year, obviously pandemic hits and had to transition to a virtual setting. But not only that, if you're not familiar with this school, this population, they serve 100% students with ASD or students who are autistic. And so it's a really challenging population to begin with, but then to move through to a virtual platform makes it even more challenging. Sammy, I saw you commented. Do you want to share a little bit about that? And then maybe, Marcy, we can hear from others who are kind of in startup or who are relatively new and what they're doing.
Yeah, so some of our families are very much on the fence of returning. So we have looked at, okay, maybe we can offer you a virtual only option for this school year just so that we can keep them engaged. And then, you know, as the outlook change, maybe mid-year, they'll be ready to come back in. All of our students, they get part of their day is education and part is therapy. And our therapy provider, the Hope Sources, as an essential business, has been able to open back up and be able to bring kids back in for their ABA therapy while we continue our virtual education. So we really just tried to be as flexible as possible to provide families what they need to hopefully keep them engaged with us, because we have lost quite a few families through this process just because they're able to go and get ADA from somewhere else. So that's what we're doing. We're bending to fit what the families need right now.
Sammy, I think it's interesting though, throughout this process, maybe you can speak more to the fact of how your parents have responded in favor of the virtual learning, which we all kind of thought was going to be a challenge for your students.
A lot of them really, really enjoyed being able to work with their child and see how they learn. And it opened up a lot of dialogue between our teachers and our families. I think we've built some really strong connections that we didn't have before with our first year being open. And it's definitely, I think, increased family engagement overall. I think we only have maybe one student that's just had trouble completely engaging, but out of the rest of our about 120 students, most of them are engaged and participating in some sort of e-learning.
And so I guess my question, obviously we heard how Sammy's kind of navigating a new school, but for those of you who are in that, first year of opening or who are going to be opening for the first time, and what is this really looking like for you? Because that's a whole different world of its own.
I'm actually living in that world, Lindsay. So I've got, I am spending a lot of time, I think, explaining the mission, talking the mission, getting evidence of the alum that the model actually works. But it's very difficult. So I'm anxious to hear from others, to see how you're doing and, if there's things that are working, you're finding that, especially if you're in that launch mode.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's anyone on from Purdue Poly that can speak to that. I know you're launching a new school in the fall. I'm trying to peek at other folks who are on who I know might be in that space.
Yeah, hey buddy. Launching a new school in a new city in the middle of a pandemic may or may not be a great idea. Because you really do, and I think as Kelly pointed out and others, I mean, you really do have to get inventive with how are you going to get the word out, because all the things we would have used in a normal year, right? We had just started doing community events and having people come. We were going out and visiting, faith-based organizations, community organizations. All of a sudden, it all shuts down. And, and again, South Bend is a very different city than Indianapolis. So some things that work in Indy don't work or won't work in South Bend. And so we've had to get really creative. I think one of the keys is not very difficult to understand is bringing somebody from the community on as a school principal. B.B. Hardrick, who joined us in March. And that really has been a big boost because it's a known name in the community. There's a level of trust there that has happened. So I think that's, again, and we're doing, again, digital marketing. I would encourage people to, we'd always been like running Facebook ads and things like that, but I think we've gotten engaged a third-party vendor to really help us like micro-target, they're testing ads, they're getting things back. And I think if you don't have that expertise in-house, which most of us don't, it's worth the money to spend to get that kind of expertise, because we just don't have it. I mean, we're a relatively good-sized organization, and we were never going to have that. We were never going to go beyond that first level of digital marketing. I think getting down into that really detailed level with the high-level algorithms and all the things that go with it is spend the money. You may not have it, but spend the money, because then you won't have the money, right? I mean, it's this whole, you got to figure out a way.
So you're seeing that pay off, Scott?
We are.
Great.
And I think it's just, that was, saying you can you keep teaching old dog new tricks? And yeah, the answer is yes. Because you just have to. You got to look at how if you think about your own personal life, all the things that show up in your feeds, right, whatever platform you're on, well, there's no secret that, when you do a search on something and all of a sudden ads start showing up on the things you're searching for, okay, the same can work for schools. You just have to employ people and companies who know how to do that. And again, the cost is not prohibitive. It's not like, you're not going to spend six figures to figure it out, but but it's also not $25. You're going to have to, but it's worth, I would say, it's my only advice there is it's worth the investment in this world, because that's the only way right now we have of really getting to people.
I think that's really good advice. I definitely can say from the schools that we have who have either marketing people in-house or who have engaged a firm for that service, they're definitely struggling with this less, absolutely, and finding just ways to connect with their families that they wouldn't necessarily have thought of otherwise.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on that, on digital marketing or being a startup school that anyone wants to share? Yvonne, is that you? Are you trying to speak to us? I can't quite hear you if you are. Yvonne, I think we're having a hard time understanding you. I'm so sorry. Maybe you can type us a message if you were trying to talk to us. If no one else wants to add anything on that point, I might shift to summer school. Kelly, back to you. How are your various schools handling summer school this year?
So we're offering 2 sessions. The first one kicked off immediately as school ended. So the June 1st, and it'll run all the way to the 26th. We're running all virtual. Living in Edmonton, I think right now. One thing I can say is that because we're offering it to our schools in Gary and then also to Next Gen here in Indy, you're saving on staff. So to Scott's point, the money that you would be putting into one area will inevitably pay off in another. Now, for summer school, because we're running virtually, and it does require less staff, it also allows for you to kickstart, any systems and everything that you're going to be putting in place for the reentry. And so we're up and running. We're offering at least 4 different courses so that our students can earn that credit. Now, the length of time that they're spending on there has literally been driven by just what we had learned in the beginning, because we were offering, basic work hours. You log on at 8, you're off at a certain time. What we're finding is a lot of our students are logging on a little later. So we've got, an AM staff and a PM staff. You got to be more strategic like that. But summer school is up and running. The teachers, it requires a lot of training. And so the leaders are having to stay engaged with the teachers to make sure that they are leveraging these virtual platforms as best they can, to make sure that students are getting FaceTime with the teacher, to make sure that they are, when they do these breakout groups, that they are meaningful. So, because we don't want it to just be a kid sitting in front of a computer for, 5 hours a day. So the training for teachers has been definitely more intentional.
Lindsay, how about your schools? What are they thinking about summer school? I guess two questions. Generally for Lindsay, how are your schools thinking about summer school? And then for Kelly, Lindsay, anyone, are you targeting summer school to particular students, or are you sort of keeping it open for everybody?
Open for everyone.
My schools have done it both ways. So some of my schools are paring down to a limited staff and have specifically targeted students based on their data. Others have just opened up a virtual platform for summer school and said anybody who wants to or needs to can enroll. The one thing I'll say is I feel like, yes, it's so important, especially with all of the learning loss that we know is going to have occurred from this pandemic. Obviously, summer school has been really an important piece for our schools, just because they're looking at their student data and trying to figure out how they can help them recover. But I do think it's really important too that this time look a little bit different just for students and families in general. Our schools that are offering virtual summer school have done a really good job of also engaging students with really fun activities. So whether it's a virtual field trip, or one of them are offering enrichment clubs. Like I just talked to one last week and they were offering African drumming, and the students were literally using like spoons and bowls. And I just thought that was so fun, right? Like it was a 30-minute session based on a 4-hour block. So there was a ton of actual academic stuff that was happening. But then there's this opportunity for clubs that kids are still getting, which is really important. And then also, I think one of our schools is offering like motivational speakers that start the day. So it's kind of a way, Kelly mentioned, you know, some of their students are wanting to log in later. They're starting actually their session with that motivational speaker, and it's just someone that's going to get the kids really excited to log in. So it's someone who has some sort of a resume that makes somebody excited, whether it's an athlete or whether it's someone in politics, but just someone who has a name that would be easily recognized and that would get the kids really motivated to log in on time. And it's just a short, like 30-minute thing, but it's getting kids in their seats and in front of the computer, so then they can actually engage with the learning after that. And that's been really successful for our schools.
That's really interesting, Lindsay. Does anyone else have any summer school strategies that they want to share? If not, I'm shift to my last formal topic that I had on my list. So I'm giving everybody a mental note now to think of questions that you have, topics that we haven't touched on, or things that you want to share, or things that you want to bring up for discussion's sake. How are you thinking about this summer about staff development, new staff onboarding, any sort of that like school culture piece that again is a little harder than normal?
So I just came from our first Leader Institute, and it's almost like you're planning for both. So, you know, leaders had the opportunity to, you know, do the basics. You're going to dig into your research. You're going to dig into your data. You're going to, you know, plan out your scripts for a strong start. But what does that strong start look like? So in the same breath where we're, you know, physically practicing how to threshold students in, we're also, okay, well, what does monitoring look like in terms of the virtual world? And so we've had to split our Leader Institute into two. So this first session was, this is what it looks like when we come back into the building. Next session will be, okay, what does monitoring, ops feedback, and you know, weekly data meetings, what do those look like in a virtual world? So as a leader, you're really planning for both. The onboarding for staff, my questions now are not just how do you engage students, but how do you engage students virtually? So even my questions for interviews have now changed. You know, are you familiar with Google Classroom? What do you know about, you know, the online platforms for credit recovery? The questions that I ask now are just very different and more intentional and aligned to what's happening now.
Lindsay, are you hearing similar things?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, so for us, it's twofold, right? Like at the authorizer level, we host an annual leadership seminar every year for all of our leaders. And that's something that's been just a really important part of our dynamic and collaborating with our schools. And this year we've decided it's appropriate to cancel that leadership seminar and just really allow our schools to focus their time and energy on their plans for fall and what that looks like. But I think, and from my perspective, there's sort of an art in knowing when to pull back with your schools and when to sort of push your people. And I think that translates to the school leader level as well, right? So as you're really thinking about gearing up for fall, and as you're thinking about staff professional development, if schools are doing some sort of a blended model, or if they are using some sort of a virtual platform still, or even if everybody goes back into their traditional brick and mortar setting, things are going to look different. And I think there's some sort of an art in knowing that balance and striking that balance appropriately, right? So how do you, when do you push your people? When's it appropriate, like Kelly said, to ask really targeted and intentional questions and support your folks with PD in areas where they may be uncomfortable or where things may be new and unique for them? And then when do you need to really pull back, And as we're thinking about gearing up for fall with our schools, and as our school leaders are working with their teachers, I know that's just been one of the questions at the forefront for us. Like, what is that balance? How do we all figure out exactly what's appropriate right now in terms of PD? And then how can we as authorizers support our schools? So we're trying to navigate this also right alongside all of you, just with a slightly different lens. But I know our schools are doing a lot of their training virtually, so a lot of them have moved to that. I think a lot of them are asking those same targeted questions that Kelly mentioned. And then some of them are actually expecting to do professional development in person in the way that they've done it in the past once school buildings open back up in July. So I'm interested actually to hear from the folks on this call just what PD looks like for all of you, or what you're kind of anticipating it look like, just for my own sake, because we need ideas also.
Anyone else willing to share?
Yeah, I'll jump in. For our new staff onboarding, we actually started last week. We do a 3-week, have since we opened, a 3-week new staff onboarding, which has always been in person. So this year, we knew we weren't going to be able to do that. So we actually created a 3-week-long Google Classroom course. And so, which obviously has some videos and stuff in it, but it also has assignments. It's got discussions. It's got all the things that go with it. So that every day, generally there's some synchronous things that happen, and then there's asynchronous, that, you know, self-directed learning, book talks, things like that that are going on with existing staff. And so then every new staff member has we call a co-pilot, that at the end of the day, they're checking in, they're going over the assignments with the staff members. They're looking at, you know, how did they put together, like one of the assignments was create a project for students, right? So now they're going over that and say, okay, how did you do, what would you have done differently? You know, let's talk about that, and then answering any questions they have. So it's given new staff members a chance to connect with existing staff members, but it's given them active work to do, right? It's tempting sometimes just to say, here's videos about our school, or here's a bunch of stuff to read, but the interactivity, actually making assignments to them, and then the bonus out of this is it also lets them use the platforms that we use and go into the tools and processes that we use, so that they have a familiarity with, okay, I've created a Google Classroom course, I've gone into the online systems, I've created projects, I know how to use the scheduling piece. So anyhow, that's been now we're starting week 2. The feedback from new staff members after the first week was really good, that they felt engaged in part of the team, which in the virtual world is really, really hard. So that was our curriculum director, Krista Primrose, came up with the idea, and then got somebody, we actually contracted somebody to do it, and they were able to develop that in about a 2 to 3 week period of time, a really robust course. And so again, getting people with expertise and having them, you know, getting smart people into, you know, doing things is really, really helpful.
Thank you.
If it's okay, Marcy.
Yeah, please.
We're using Pixus. So I believe, you know, if you use 5-star, it's free to you. I don't know what it costs other than that, but it's like an online. Does everyone know what Pixus is? PYXIS. And so it's like an online PD for staff. And so it has a lot of things like, you know, how to use Flipgrid and, you know, those kind of things. So if there's certain things that you've kind of leaned into as a school that you want other people to catch up on, so you can kind of assign them different PD and kind of track when they did it. And so we're looking at using that for some, we gave everyone 1 day of summer PD, just doing all of the Google Classroom and, you know, how to use Rooms and Zoom, or Google Hangouts is getting ready to have Rooms. So a lot of that tech stuff that everyone's on different pages with.
So I'd love to hear any other thoughts on summer school, but here's also the time for you to bring up any other topics that we haven't chatted about yet. And we've heard a lot of different ideas, but we've still gone through things pretty quickly. So if there's any other topics or challenges you want to discuss in the time we have left, please throw them in now. And Kelly or Lindsay too, if there are other things that you, some additional thoughts that you want to share about anything.
I don't want to put her on the spot, but I saw Heather come off of mute. Oh, I think
I'm at Crystal House Doors, and so we are an adult high school. But for our staff, what we've offered during June is the Google Educator training, parts 1 and 2. So we're able to pay for the exam for our staff, and so they're able to do that asynchronously. And then the understanding is that when they come in July, since our staff is small enough, we're able to gather as a staff in July. And so hopefully they will have had that Google Educator training as a base level, and we'll have that common vocabulary and everything moving forward. And before the pandemic even started, our leadership team had decided that we were going to have Google Classroom in the fall next year. So it kind of fell in line with that goal that we had created for the upcoming school year. So coming in July, all of our teachers will have that Google Educator training. Then we can kind of move forward with how we will train our students on how to use that as kind of a first week, whether we are in person or virtual, on how to use everything related to that platform. And then when we're in person, we won't have to use that time to train in the Google at all. And then we can use that time to work with, what are we going to do with how to handle the pandemic, and how are we going to move forward, and then also use some time to work with other things that are happening, like what do we want to do with what's happening socially, and how are we going to handle that as well, because we have a lot of students who come from different backgrounds, as a lot of our other schools do. So how are we going to balance our time when we're in person with other things that are happening in the world and not just the pandemic? And how are we going to open our schools, and are we going to be virtual or blended, or how we're going to work with that? But we like the fact that we were able to offer that to our teachers to do on their own time, and then come in and be able to use our time together in different ways. So we were excited about able to do that, and not have to spend all of our time on, what kind of virtual platform we're going to use together.
Thanks, Heather.
Marcy, I don't know if you saw the comments, but Peg had a really great question, I think.
Thanks, I had missed that one. It's hard for our school to adequately know how to staff our school since we don't know what our enrollment will be. Is there a date that others believe is indicative of when to determine staffing needs? Excellent question. One school that I know of, I believe, actually each year, regardless of what happens, sets particular dates, a couple times each fall, by when they typically know if they have, around X% of their final students, and are they at that point meeting, is it sort of, are they on track at that point to get to their, particular enrollment? And if they're closer, maybe then they won't, riff or anything like that at that point. But, I think they have a couple check-in points all the way leading up to I think it's at like 2 weeks after school starts is when I think they typically say that they usually, around max out their enrollment. And what do other folks do?
I have a thought on this. I was in that same boat, and I was really hesitating filling positions that were open. And then I just started thinking about the sickness that's going to happen this year. And I'm going to fill all the spots, and I'm going to add another position. And so I don't know how many of you got the PPP money, but I felt like it was the right way to use that funding, is to make sure, that when we are open, that we have appropriate staff I anticipate that our staff is going to be the first ones to really get ill. And, got to think about it. I know our community is about 3% that has had it. And then every time that they have any symptoms at all, they have to stay home. And so, for me, I'm going to just make sure we have bulked up staff and extra people.
Barb, will that allow you to do, I assume that'll allow you to do substitutes in-house too?
Well, I know Kelly, I don't know who uses who for subbing, is like, they're not going to have hardly anybody this year. And we use mostly parents for subbing. And the ones that mostly subbed for us last year have said we won't be subbing this year because of the pandemic. So, I'm really just trying to get extra people in the building so I can move them around where they're needed.
I think what Barbara's saying is absolutely true. We're looking into hiring 2 additional people per campus just as floaters, because, we can anticipate what's going to happen, in the event that someone becomes ill. And so, where you'd spend a lot of time loading up on your content specialist, I think we're looking more at, the additional support staff. And then also, I was wondering, I wanted to put a question out there to everyone on the call. Is there anything that you're doing intentionally to attend to the trauma piece when students reenter? Because, this has been a hard enough time on all of, on everyone, but for the student that is going home to an unsafe environment and has been there, this entire time, and the struggles that they've had to deal with. Are there any intentional things that you're doing upon reentry for those students?
Some of those things, Kelly, too, we might touch on in the next session. But of course, everything kind of blends into each other. So if no one wants to share anything at this moment, put on notice that we'll keep talking about that.
I can speak to a little bit, Marcy. So I'm Katie Curley. I'm in Gary as well at Steel City Academy. And so we have an advisory model that we call Squad. And that was single-handedly our strongest component of our virtual learning model, aligned to one of our principles around like human connection. That's what people need right now more than anything. And so we have anticipated, it was 30 minutes in our Q4 virtual learning experience every single day, every single morning. And then we closed out every single day, 15 minutes closing circle. We're looking at some virtual curriculums. And so Transforming Education has a trauma-informed SEL curriculum with some videos and some really strong curriculum and objectives already written K through 12. So we're doing a lot of unpacking of that. And then we created an SEL for SCA Google site, which has just a plethora of resources from meditation exercises to, some Headspace free logins that, meditation app, journal prompts. And so students sort of have kind of a choose your own adventure SEL menu every week that they're doing activities and tasks from our SEL for SEA. And then we have different like affinity groups to opt into throughout the day to sort of process in different sorts of ways. And we've gotten a lot for parents, staff, and students, right? All of us need it. And so we found like a lot of power in the opt-in Google Meets for these different SEL components.
Thank you.
I promised at the beginning that we would try to wrap up a few minutes early so folks could take a quick break before the next session starts. Kelly and Lindsay, thank you so much for helping us lead this discussion. And thank you for we've really appreciated hearing from all of you and making this a real discussion. Do you, any last thoughts from Kelly or Lindsay before we pause and take a quick break and come back by 10:05 at the latest?
I think just continuing opportunities like this. I have been I've worked more collaboratively with leaders across the state than ever before. And it is just proven effective because we're all servicing, students, and we all want what's best for our students. So I appreciate you all. And again, just continue the collaborative spirit.
Yeah, I think I'll just quickly say, in this, I know just as a leader in general, it's really easy to focus on everyone else and what's happening next and how are we serving kids and all of the next steps. But I think sometimes it's easy to forget about you. It's easy to forget about your own mental health. It's easy to forget about your own needs, but also just how are you gearing up for the fall? Because you've probably thought about every other thing. You've thought about bathroom breaks and schedules and rotating kids and virtual learning, but have you really thought about what leadership looks like in this environment? And if not, I would just encourage you to spend a few minutes really thinking about your role, how you support folks, but also hold them accountable. Because I know I'm often the last person to think about that. And then I'm like, shoot, I have to go lead. So, so good luck to all of you. I know this is going to be challenging for everyone, but I'm sure everyone will rise to the challenge and be amazing. And I'm excited to see what new, exciting, awesome things come from this venture.
So thanks again, Kelly and Lindsay. We will commence our, 5-6 minute break, and we will see you all back here just a couple minutes after 10.
Marcy, I think you're muted.
Thanks, Tim. Sorry about that. I just went the wrong direction. Welcome back. I was just saying to nobody except Ted in the room here that to the extent you're able to, given where you're sitting and who's there with you, we'd love to see your faces if that's possible, to just make this feel a little more conversational, a little bit more like we're here together. But with that, we'll get going with the panel that I know that a lot of you have joined us here to chat about today. There are no shortage of topics within this that we can go down. Again, just like last time, I have sort of a list of what I think are the high points, the things that people are most interested about. But please jump in at any point, and this conversation can go lots of different directions. I want to thank a panel of 3 very helpful longtime school leaders who've joined us to help lead the discussion. Tim Mulheron, Irvington Community School in Indianapolis, Tommy Reddix from the 3 Paramount Schools of Excellence in Indianapolis, and Katie Curley from Steel City Academy in Gary. We're also joined by our authorizer partner for this session, James Betley from the Indiana Charter School Board, who has served in, who's an attorney by training and has served in a number of state government roles. So he's got a lot of great perspective that I know will help us in this conversation. So without further ado, again, feel free to use the checkbox and, the chat box, and or also to just jump in if you want to yell out a question or a comment or help us move the conversation in a way that helps you. But I will get going with the major question, which I think is, what are the pathways, so to speak, that you all are thinking about for the fall? Are you thinking about 2 different pathways, sort of a virtual and sort of an in-person? Are you thinking of 3 with a hybrid in there? Let's start there and tell us what you're thinking. Tim, you're unmuted, so you get to go first.
Thanks, Marcy. Well, because this is a rolling phenomenon, it's you got to prepare for as many things as possible with extremely short summer. So we've been certainly looking at a hybrid model where the kids will be coming in several days a week and have a blend of e-learning and on campus, probably having kids in the building all day, twice a week. And the Wednesdays this is all very tentative, and I'm sure it's the same with every school, right? We're making plans today for what could change tomorrow. Wednesdays we'll have more e-learning, but we'll do a deep cleaning that day, and we also do a deep cleaning over the weekend. And then our cleaning protocol is, of course, increased vastly from what it's been typically. And so we're looking at that. We're also preparing for e-learning. The states, everyone's been following the news, which I'm sure we all have, as of late, 22 states are seeing a resurgence of coronavirus diagnosed cases. So Indiana's in a reopening mode too. So it'll be really interesting to see how things can potentially change as the school year approaches. So we're just looking at both those things as primary models. We're still debating, like what days we would have kids in, and reaching out to parents and getting some ideas. The surveying question is really interesting. We'll be doing a survey shortly. On one hand, I'm reluctant to send out questions like, what do you think we should do? Because that sends out some interesting messages and invitations for parents. But we'll be doing some of that shortly. So that's what we're looking at doing right now. I assume just about everybody's going to have a hybrid model, other than I did hear from some ends of the state where, because this is such a politicized issue, which is very strange for a public health emergency in my mind, but I've heard of schools that will be opening to all kids at once in some areas of southern Indiana. So I'm assuming that's not going to happen in the Indianapolis area, but that's where we stand right now.
Tim, for your 2 days a week, maybe I missed it. I was trying to take some notes. Yeah. Are you thinking some kids come on 2 days and other kids come on the other 2 days, with Wednesday being the?
Yeah, because of social distancing, we're going to honor that, and so we have to reduce the number of kids in our buildings by 50%, and that's an interesting challenge. I hope some other schools out there have the opportunity to use other facilities, maybe get the kids in person more often, but you got to hire more staff. So we were looking at a Monday, Tuesday, a Monday, Thursday, Tuesday, Friday rotation, like kind of an A and B. And we seem to be getting closer to saying that's what we'll be doing. Have yet to tell our parents that, have to get it approved at the board meeting next week, but that's how we're moving.
So Katie or Tommy, what's your sort of thinking right now?
I'll jump in. Yeah, we're taking a different approach. We're gonna have all kids back, but I don't want to say that without qualifying it. We're going to do a 3-track system where we have 1 track that would serve our parents who have to work and have no place for those kids to go. So they can come into the school every single day, that we can remain open. We'll have a middle track that is come when you're comfortable. And that can be a rolling group that flexes in and out, that will be serving digitally with our e-learning platform. And then we'll have a permanent e-learning group that we can say, until you're ready, and if that's next year, just fine, we'll be serving you with a crew of teachers that can handle that. And that 3-pronged approach for us, I think, allows us to say very transparently to the parent that the choice is yours, and we can serve that choice. I think the struggle there is making sure that we can flex and move our staff in a way to where we're not hiring dual staffs to handle the same student body, and that's not feasible. So it's about stretching and moving existing people into that e-learning platform, so we can make sure we can cover our parents when they're out, and keeping our fidelity in our e-learning really high. And we also see this as an opportune time for proof of concept, because we would be fools not to think that after this year is over, that there's not a whole group of parents that have now been trained to think that they would like their schooling to happen from home. And we might need to have some kind of model for them at the outcome of this to make sure we can continue to serve that group of parents, so we could see a decline in enrollment post-pandemic, if we get to post-pandemic. And if we don't get to post-pandemic, well, just the same, that hybrid of having the e-learning very strong and still data-driven and good fidelity is going to be important for us to have modeled out. I think when we're talking about all kids in the school at one time, we're working off the pod or bubble-based concepts, where, I mean, even if I think we social distance our kindergarten, first, second graders, there's no way to control that in a way to where we'd have fidelity. And so our goal is to make sure that those classrooms don't touch other classrooms. And so wherever the kids go into school, that bubble is going to be protected. And how we'll define that to the rest of our staff is, if you're going to break in or out of that bubble, there's going to be sanitization structures in place for you to go through that process. So if a classroom leaves their bubble out into the hall, there's going to be a process. If an administrator wants to come in and do an observation while you're breaking into the bubble, there's a process. So those kinds of structures for us will help Our weakest points are going to be transition times, lunch and recess. To respect our teachers and not burn them out, we are going to have lunch in lunchrooms, but we have a lot of space in our various lunchrooms. So we have re-coordinated our lunch to make sure that classes are together. Whenever possible, there's no students sitting across from each other. So we stay bubbled in that. Recess is really tough. If you have recess equipment, every child that walks out and touches a bar of recess equipment is potentially spreading a germ. And so, believe it or not, we purchased backpack sprayers that can spray down and disinfect the entire recess area pretty efficiently, pretty quickly. Tim mentioned janitorial. We've got deep cleaning set up for every single night. So those kinds of structures are what we're moving forward with at this point.
Tommy, I have two follow-up questions for you. One, what does the sort of middle model look like where parents can move in and out to their comfort? Does that mean literally any given day they could be in either model? And my second follow-up question is, want you to address it. Obviously, there's been some uncertainty about whether, if you want to do a virtual model, how the state's going to pay for that. I just want, if you don't mind touching on the announcement that came out Friday around that.
Sure. Yeah, we've had a good debate among our administrators for how to handle that middle tier of parents who want to flex in and out. Obviously, we can't have daily movement there. It would be too stressful on the school population. It would be bad for kids to have that inconsistency with their instructors. So what we're doing is allowing those who are in e-learning to opt in every month to come back to the school level. So it'll be a once a month choice. We won't be pushing very hard for our families who are not in e-learning to opt out of our schools and into an e-learning model. But we're telling everybody it's your choice. But when you're in e-learning, announcements will go out monthly to ask families, would you like to come back into brick and mortar or not, to make sure that they know that there's those transition periods. And we feel like that gives us the cleanest switch between teachers and instructors. We talked about quarterly, but we felt like that was a little restrictive. In terms of funding, funding was a major concern in terms of the 51% rule of declaring that your kids are receiving virtual instruction. And the memo that came out Friday was very reassuring, and I'm now hearing we've got bipartisan support on that memo, which is really good. And it basically says that if you weren't a virtual school before the pandemic, or you weren't planning to open a virtual school this fall, if you were just a regular traditional public charter school before this, then no matter how much virtual instruction or brick and mortar instruction your students receive, in your ME report, you can label it as COVID related, and your students will be funded at 100%. So this was very important for charter schools, very important for all schools, to know that we have that flexibility to serve our kids however we can through this pandemic and not risk losing any funding through the process.
Thank you. Katie, would you like to talk about Steel City's current plans?
Sure. So I think it's very typical for me as a leader, and maybe several of you on the call, to get really initially start to roll our sleeves up and get into the nitty gritty of the plans. And what we did is did a step back and created a community stakeholder reopen task force to really start with what are our guiding principles of how we're making decisions and plans on this work. And from that, we kind of identified four. And one of our underlying principles is that, we believe in school choice, and we believe in parent and family choice in this. We also have that one, our job is, our most important work is to keep our kids and our staff alive and safe, which is a crazy thing to say as a school leader. So we are operating on 2 tracks, a full virtual track and then a reduced in the building student track. And that will be operated by family and staff choice on a monthly survey. So currently, when we did our end of the year survey, we had 78% of our staff who still, based upon the Gary health indicators, do not feel comfortable returning to school and in building school, and 70% of parents. And so we're responding to that data to create a virtual track with two tracks within that, a daily track and a night school track for virtual, and then an in-building with significantly reduced students. We will have a lot of individual conversations with parents and families for some of our most vulnerable students we think could benefit the most from being in the building. Special education, MTSS, our most disengaged students in the virtual world, so that we can continue to provide the essential resources, the holistic support, and the highest quality education that we can. And so we're also then, going to work on a staffing model that allows staff to opt into the model that's most aligned with where they need to be and the health conditions and age of some of our staff as well. So that's currently what we're thinking about.
Katie, for reduced students in the building, are you thinking along the lines of sort of what Tim is, like some people, like a pod of people on certain days?
Yep, we'd have like little cohort groups, and students would stay in their classroom. We'd have adults move, and we'd just be really intentional about the selection of those student cohort groups.
Hey, Marcy.
Yeah.
I just want to throw something out. So after the three of us have talked a little bit, over the weekend, I read the American Enterprise Institute's blueprint for back to school, which was prompted by the last session we had. And a couple things I saw in there were really interesting. One was, to quote what they had to say in their forward, "We are not public health experts," which prefaced everything they had to say.
Yeah.
And schools will have to coordinate in new ways with state and local health officials to develop a unified public health strategy. That's not happening, at least in the Indianapolis area. I know it is in northern Indiana with Parkview Hospital, and great, lots of kudos to them and the local schools that are working together. And just my editorial comment, it's a public health emergency. So the fact that schools have to work so hard at figuring out operations independently of one another, and I really appreciate this conversation, is just a failure of government locally, state, and nationally. Because if it is a public health emergency, we should all be getting on the same page. And I made a suggestion in Marion County that the schools would minimally be on the same page when it came to safety precautions. That ain't happening either. So we're all doing our thing, and I'm really glad we're sharing all this information. But I had to say it before I moved on, that it's very disappointing that we're being put in this position.
James, do you have any thoughts based on where you're at with your portfolio of schools?
So Tim, you're probably super excited to see Representative Jim Banks' bill to deny federal funding to schools.
It was awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost, it's like you said, this has become so politicized that decisions aren't being made for the right reasons. And, I read the AEI guidance as well. And, the funny thing that struck me was the DOE guidance wasn't really guidance, first of all. It was a checklist of health and safety measures that's 40 pages long, which they quickly caveat by saying, we're not responsible for this.
Right.
Check with your local health and safety folks. We're not going to ask for, any sort of documentation from you all, but here is the kitchen sink. Now you just pick which works best for you.
Right.
And we declaim all liability. Talk to your lawyer, talk to your local health. And, given that we have schools all over the state, that worries me quite a bit. As you said, just personally, I'm talking personally, and then we'll talk about me in my authorizer hat, that's going to be the benefit of state and local health guidance is going to vary widely depending on where you are in the state. So, yeah, I was disappointed in the IDOE guidance. I've been disappointed with, and I don't know if I can say this as a, executive branch employee, I've been disappointed with the lack of guidance from the governor's office, other than to say, hey, July 1, you guys are on your own, right? That's basically all we've gotten from them. It's my understanding, following up on what Tommy said earlier, that the governor's office was not at all involved in IDOE's memo regarding the virtual funding. Now, I know that obviously the governor's office has nothing to do with that. That's primarily the legislature. And what worries me about that is that technically they have no authority to issue that memo, right? Because what they're doing has a significant fiscal impact. They are redefining statute to provide coverage for schools. Now, I think it's the absolute right thing to do. But what worries me, because I'm a pessimist, is that they're just hanging out there. DOE's hanging out there right now. You said, Tommy, that you'd heard that there's bipartisan support. That's great, but where is it? I haven't heard anyone say anything. Have you? I mean, I assume it's just anecdotal on your part at this point.
We heard it from Seamus and Bob Baining.
Okay, well, that's interesting considering, didn't Bob Baining just a week ago say that the 85% law was the 85% law at one of these conferences? Right. So here's the thing, conflicting messages. Seamus is a lawyer. He's not a legislator. He's not Bray, he's not Houston. And I would feel a hell of a lot better if those two issued some sort of statement saying, we're not going to come into regular session and undo your expectations. Because right now your expectations are the IDOE memo. Everyone knows that that's out there, right? Like I said, I confirmed that the governor's office was not involved. So they essentially, their response to me was, well, it depends on what the legislature does. Now, unlikely the legislature is meeting in special session at this point. I would be flabbergasted if they met in January and undid what DOE is trying to do with this memo. That would be catastrophic and politically for them and everything else. So maybe their inaction is in fact action. But it just, part of me just still says, it's still in my head with my schools, and I'm going to reiterate this, just be careful. You know, when you're doing your contingency planning, you know, I hear all virtual, just be careful. Because we could get some statement that, you know, you could have some wonks in LSA running numbers right now and realizing that that's essentially, because we were just as, and I'm getting a little bit in the weeds because I think this is important. I mean, obviously how much you guys get funded really is going to dictate what you all can do. That DOE memo probably cost $1 trillion to actually fully implement, right? I'm being hyperbolic, but on purpose. So what worries me is that, you know, our agencies just turned in all of our amended reversion budgets. You know, we're required to revert 15%. And they're right now busily crunching the numbers as to how much that's going to save them in the governor's office. At some point, and this was Friday, was when they were due. So at some point, those people crunching those numbers are going to meet with the legislature and they're going to have a hard conversation about what it's going to mean. And you know someone's doing those calculations right now about what happens if we treat COVID-related virtual instruction as 100% instruction. So again, not to start off on too high of a note, I'm just hoping that you all are cautious until we get some sort of confirmation. And I may very well, just as an authorizer, say, reach out to the legislative leaders and say, I need something.
James, I think that would be a perfect thing for you to do sitting in your seat, would be to ask for something official, because you would have very good standing to say, I don't feel safe, you know, blessing my school's plans if they want to do a fully virtual plan without seeing something from you, like fiscal leaders in writing. To that end, that is our understanding that the fiscal leaders of the House and Senate have agreed to this. Again, but you're right that caution is probably the best way to go until you have it in writing.
If they've agreed to it, why not say it? I guess that's all I'm asking. I mean, they did that with the hold harmless, right? I mean, they came out prior to them actually doing anything statutorily, and said we're going to do hold harmless. Like, there's precedent for this, which leads me into the second thing that I think as an authorizer is the most important possible thing that an authorizer can do at this point, is be flexible, right? So each authorizer is slightly different in terms of the way that they do their processes, right? I am meeting with my board on Wednesday and am going to, because of the way my board's set up, right now I have to bring every change requested by a school to my board for formal approval, which is simply just not possible, right? I mean, I expect that we're going to be getting plans that clearly are materially different than what was in their charter or what was in their charter application, right? I mean, these are adaptations that are made, you know, necessarily due to this public health emergency. And so I think that one of the most important things I, as an authorizer, can do is be flexible, is to not, you know, some of these plans are completely unprecedented, right? I mean, we're going to try to do our best to stay on top of what best practices are in terms of running parallel tracks and 3 tracks and 2 tracks and pods and bubbles and deep cleaning and all of this stuff, and try to make the best decision based on what's best, what each of our schools' situations are like. You know, I have schools who are in a better position than other schools in terms of financially, space and buildings, you know, location. I mean, things that are, and we sort of talked, the 4 of us talked the other day about all of this, and there were just so many things that kept coming up that seemed very small, but when you look at them in toto, they start to really add up. You know, Tommy mentioned hydration in students as one that he hasn't brought up yet, right? Masks, how much all this deep cleaning costs, who does it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as an authorizer, you know, my goal right now is not to be a burden on my schools, is not to tell you what you can't do, but to help you get to a place where you can do, you know, what you can do based on what resources are available to you. So honestly, I'm not even thinking about accountability right now, really, at all. I mean, we're going to bring it up to our board because we have to, but, you know, given, I mean, even before the pandemic, that was a difficult question. And I actually had one school ask me, well, what are your expectations? Because we'll modify our plan to meet your expectations. And I think that's a horrible question, right? That should not be the question. The question should be, what can we do that's best for our students, you know, in order to minimize disruption on them, handle all the other things that we're talking about, the social, emotional, the trauma, you know, equality of education. You know, how can you ensure that your brick and mortar track is providing an equivalent level that your virtual track is and your modified track, right? I mean, we don't know right now because they're different delivery systems. And so again, from the authorizing perspective, at least from my perspective, my job right now is how do I get you guys as much flexibility and as much support as possible to get your plans in place. There'll be plenty of time later on, years from now, most likely, before we figure out how successful those plans were, right? And maybe, you know, I'm breaking from the mold, you know, the hardcore accountability folks, but I just don't think that we're serving kids by putting up roadblocks and stumbling blocks. So, I mean, that's my sort of opening statement. I'm sure that most other authorizers agree with me. I think most other authorizers, I think Lindsay and Patrick and others have a lot more flexibility in granting amendments than I do. So I am hoping that my board will allow me to do what I need to do to enable you all to do what you need to do. So that's sort of my opening statement in terms of the things that are the most important things that I can do as an authorizer right now.
Thank you, James. I'd like to ask some of you all to jump in if you have plans or, you know, sort of plans or things that you're kicking around right now that are a little bit different than what Tim and Katie and Tommy have talked about. We'd love to hear of some like kind of alternate options, especially maybe if you're in a place in the state where your community is expecting something different of you. And James sort of brought up 2 other things that I wouldn't mind hearing from folks on. Perhaps that you haven't gotten everything you need yet from the state in terms of guidance. I'd love to hear things that you wish, you know, categories of things that you wish you could still get guidance from them regarding. And then also things, you know, kind of on the converse side, things that you wish that you had additional flexibility on right now. Please feel free to jump in and speak up. That might be a lot for anyone to put in the text box.
Well, man, this is Don. I'm the director of finance for Matchbook Learning at Wendell Phillips School 63. Our charter is the mayor's office. So it's what we're trying to do on a budget side is take all of these. I'm trying to get as much information as I possibly can because we're actually having a finance meeting next week, and you know we're probably going to budget with 7 to 10% less than what we planned on, just based on some of the conversations that you guys have been having this morning. But in those terms, we're looking at just the school layout and how we can have every kid in our building every day and still maintain the because it's such a gray area right now with the health concerns, and no one wants to take responsibility, or no one wants to take, and I get that. I mean, I totally do. But what we're trying to, I guess, based on the guidance, I don't know where the 17 students per classroom came. I don't know where that whole guidance came from. But we're trying to look at, there'll be no specials really. So, cause you can't really move students, cause it sounds like teachers are going to move in our building versus students moving. So we're dealing with like our gym. Can we put 2 classrooms in our gym and have an instructional assistant with our teachers still responsible for on the days? So like a Tuesday and a Thursday we came up with a plan to have about 120 students outside of their normal classrooms, but they can still come to school every day if parents are comfortable with that. Because if you do the Monday, Wednesday, what I'm concerned about is how do we feed those kids that don't come to school? Like, do we give them a special time to come get food at school? How do you feed them? How do you do all the other things that we do for kids other than educate, especially in the areas that we're educating in? But we're just looking at it at a budget standpoint to how to save, because we're going to be spending money totally on, everybody bought it reminds me of the Ghostbusters movie back in the old days with the jetpacks on your back and you're spraying everything. The custodians are spraying everything down, and those devices cost money. It cost us $12,000 to purchase those kind of devices. But we're looking at savings in other areas. On the virtual side, we're giving the same opportunities to parents that don't feel comfortable with coming back. So we've had to hire a couple extra teachers to run virtual classrooms. Hopefully we get more kids in the building, which I think we will, because we're different than some of the people. I mean, we're a innovation school, so we serve a neighborhood. So our kids are going to come to school. It's just because we're the neighborhood school. But we're trying to figure out financially how that's going to affect us. So when we do present our financials to the mayor's office, they don't laugh us out of the building. So that's what we're in the middle of right now. Just how to save here and spend more here on the health concerns. So that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you, Don. Anyone else thinking about different ways to set up their school days? Yeah, Barb, please.
Yeah, I'll share a little bit. I've been talking to our local school superintendent. I agree, it is a pain that no one is working together. Really encouraged our health department to get all the schools together and share the same information. And we're just all doing our own thing. But they are doing everyone at the same time because they can't really figure out a way to do it without doing that. And I said, well, what are you going to do when all your teachers, you got 20% of your teachers out? They have 700 staff members that are over the age of 65, and So anyway, there are so many pieces to that. So we've already decided to do some kind of different schedule, and we're just looking at it because we have birth through high school at our school. So we're looking at each level differently, but we're going to do the 50%. And we have doors to the outside. So we're going to have every class come in from the door to the outside and go out. And they don't really ever walk through the building unless they are ill and going to the dozen sick bay that we have, we're creating. But I think that if you don't do 50%, how do you handle the classes when the staff can't be there? I couldn't figure out how to do that. So that's why that's one of the big reasons we're doing 50% on top of the social distancing piece. And the other part is that any family that needs to be there all day, we're hopefully, from our surveying, it looks like we can have them all in there. So if we have 50% of the class and only 35% come because the other 15% parents aren't bringing them, and then you have another 15% that wants to be there all week, then they could be there all week because they're taking the parts of the other. So, from what I've gauged, we'll still have about 50%, and some classes will have a little bit over that because some of those kids need to be there all day so families can work. And I think that might be, I don't know, you had mentioned that a lot of your kids are getting the lunch program, so maybe that satisfies that. Maybe that doesn't, but that's how we're doing that.
Tommy, I think you said you wanted to jump in on something.
Yeah, Kevin Kabaki made a comment about knowing how we're thinking about the response when we get a positive case in the school. Mm-hmm. Do we go virtual for 2 to 5 days? Is it just a cohort or bubble like I was talking about? There's so many multiple considerations here. And the first one is really kind of scary, and that's per DOE recommendations, and I don't necessarily disagree, is having a single room designated for students suspected of being positive for COVID. That sounds nice on the surface, but if you're putting a child from the nurse's office into a certain room in the school, the psychological and stereotypical ramifications of that are pretty heavy. But what else do you do? You can't sit them outside on the front sidewalk. And so trying to figure out how that process works is pretty challenging. And then as guinea pigs in this game, we have to immediately contact Marion County Public Health when we have a positive confirmed case, and they will provide best guidelines on how we should react. I think that's when we're talking about bubbles and pods, and it gets into assigned seating for everything. We're going to create live Google documents for assigned seating for students when they go to lunch, when they sit in a classroom, wherever they may be. So if contact tracing is an issue and MCHD wants to come in and say, who had contact with this positive child, we can show them a list and potentially decrease the amount of school closure time, because we can say who would need to then quarantine or be isolated. And that's a shot in the dark. There's no guarantee that we get away with not shutting down the whole building. And at any given time, we know as a staff, we have to be prepared to close the doors for 10 days. If we have a big outbreak, all of our staff know that we'll go right back into that e-learning mode for the entire population. And we need to be ready to shift gears throughout the entire year for that.
Can I ask what everybody's doing about taking temperatures in every day? Are you all going to go that path?
That's a whole next topic, I think.
Sorry.
No, you're fine, Jean. I think it's perfectly fine to switch to that. Mm-hmm. But that includes how are we doing health screenings for students, staff, and any visitors to the building, and liability for anyone who does potentially get sick. Is anyone concerned about that? And then temperature screenings, masking, all that.
Okay.
I can speak. Courtney Eckerly, I'm the Director of Operations at Circle City Prep. At least for temperature checks, what we're planning right now, we have previously opened doors for students when they arrive at the school. So right now we're going to have designated people outside wearing masks and gloves. We have touchless thermometers now that don't need to touch the forehead. And we're going to be outside and basically have one hand that's your door opening hand and one hand that's your thermometer hand, and take the temperature of the kid in the car. And that way, if they have a temperature, they haven't gotten out of the car, we don't have to worry about putting them someplace and then contacting their parents and trying to do that. It's just they would just stay in the car and then go home with their parents. And then, monitoring that 72-hour fever-free requirement before they're allowed to come back into the school. And I don't know if that's probably not feasible for like really much like bigger schools, but just something to think about. Like we are trying to think like, okay, if they come into the building and they have a temperature, then where are we putting them? How are we getting in touch with families, and things like that? Just considerations to have to go through for that.
Question on the temperature checks. What is the temperature that we're supposed to be using? Is it
100.4 or above?
100.4. Okay. And that came from, where did that come? I mean, I Googled that as well, and it did say 100.4 because it can fluctuate.
That was in that crazy long memo, that was the temperature threshold.
All right. Thank you.
I had a quick question about the meal delivery piece of it. Have we heard from USDA if they're allowing meals to be taken off site after 6:30? I know originally we got a waiver from them saying that we could deliver meals to homes or that kids could take them off site, but the last I saw is that expired on June 30th. And then if it continued past that, we wouldn't get reimbursed.
Yeah, there's been no change to that guidance, ma'am. Right now, it is June 30th through what I'm operating off of for our grab and go meals right now.
Okay.
So what I did was send an email to, because we're still partners with IPS, so I still use IPS food. So it kind of makes it easier for me because they get most of the marching orders, and then I just have to follow what is said. But I did send an email, so if I do find out anything new about that, because I got a feeling that it will be extended past June 30th, because the need of children eating, it still outweighs the I think still outweighs the all of the rules and regulations behind it. So I think it will be extended through the summer though.
I'm looking at the Indiana, and maybe I'm mistaking the question, but according to the IDOE updated FAQ, food service waivers have been extended through August 31st for non-congregate feeding, parent pickup, and meal service times.
That is very helpful, sir. Thank you.
It's number, if you want to confirm it, don't take my word for it. It's, God, I can't get it's like on page 2 of their updated FAQ.
Thanks so much, sir.
To get to the topic that Jean brought up, Tim or Katie, do you want to talk about what you're thinking in terms of health screenings and things along those lines?
Go ahead, Katie.
Thanks so much, Tim. Yeah, very similar to what was shared from Courtney is 100% of people before entering the building on the temperature check, and having those at our 4 exterior doors. And then I think it's a great idea, the staying in cars. I hadn't even thought about that. So thank you for sharing that. And then I think what we're thinking a lot about is then individual health and safety plans for students and staff that have any, pre-existing condition. So looking a lot at like Colorado Public Schools has some great templates. And that's kind of where our head's at, in addition to sort of the tier 1 screening, then what are the unique and individual health and safety plans we have in place for kids and staff. And then certainly the PPE and the mask, which I'd love to hear people's thoughts on how they're approaching that and thinking about that in terms of both students and staff.
Yeah,
sorry.
I'm glad Katie brought up the masks, because I can't wait to see where this conversation goes, because that's another one of those issues where we're trying to figure out what is the right thing to do, what's the right thing to do by the students, what are the politicized elements within our families and within our staff, what our obligation is. So we're kind of going back and forth on that. We're going to step into it. IUPUI put out some guidance for their folks, I think a week or 2 ago, and said everyone's going to be wearing a mask on campus. I think that was independent of the IU system, but everyone, students, professors, instructors, staff members at all times, that's not going to happen. Once that school, once they're in a classroom, I can very easily see where a professor is going to take off a mask, and it's going to be followed suit by a group of people that's largely not going to be affected by this. So, when we look at it's scientifically valid right now that kids are basically vectors and they're not going to be getting sick. The people that are going to be getting sick are the ones who are going to be serving them in the schools. And that's teachers, and that's people with compromised immune systems, other compromised issues, and elder staff, of which I am one. So the masking is a fascinating issue. We're debating it. We haven't arrived at a conclusion yet. We think it's going to be one of those strongly suggest for students, and then in the classrooms, but then in the public spaces, I don't know. It's just so messy. And then for staff, we do have the right to mandate that, and we may be doing it. But this is where I fall back on when we're not giving clear guidance from government that's supposed to be managing issues like this, then we're stuck in a very interesting situation. So I've already had debates with staff people, with the skeleton crew, that I had to come down and get pretty crappy with some of our folks about, you will wear a mask when I'm nearby. You're not going to kill me if I can help it. And the common sense aspect has gone out the window. If you all have been outside and looking at reopening, what's going on in Indiana, I ride the Monon Trail a lot, and it's interesting. The last 2 weeks, the masks have just disappeared, and people are just kind of doing their thing. So that's going to filter into our schools, and it's going to affect the way we're managing our staff and the way we're managing our children. And then when you get into some of these pissing matches where, taking temperatures and sending people home, there's going to be complete disruption as to what a school day from an hour by hour and minute by minute is supposed to look like. So we're trying to think through those issues to streamline them as best we can from a practical standpoint. And about temperature checks, we're looking at some machinery where you can walk up to a monitor, and within a second you can take your temperature and identify the child. Those are very expensive pieces of equipment. I've heard that the metropolitan school districts, because of the enormous number of kids they manage, they're not going to be taking temperatures. I don't know if anyone else has heard that. So I'm babbling and just throwing out. We could go on and on about just the masks alone.
If I could just interject real quick, if you all, so I'm sort of taking notes here because the lawyer in me is raising interesting questions. I know EEOC has issued COVID-19 guidance for employees, but that doesn't include students. And I know Tommy had made an offhand comment the other day that, they can refuse to have their temperature taken. I don't know if that's, I don't know, personally don't know if that's correct or not. Which from an authorizer perspective, from a liability perspective, what happens if someone refuses to have their temperature taken? What happens if they get out of the car anyway because the parents got to go to work and now you're stuck with a kid? What happens if you put a kid with a high temperature into a room and you have 10 people with high temperatures and they're all in the same room and only one of them's infected, right? What are you doing with those other 9 kids? And I also want to highlight what Tim had said. There was a study that just came out, I think today or yesterday, basically saying that we have vastly underestimated the number of vectors who are actually young people, right? That these non-asymptomatic or very low symptom young people are often the ones most responsible for spreading the disease to the folks who are affected by it. And the thing that is always stuck with me is this graphic that I saw many weeks ago about the mask that you're wearing protects everybody else. It does not protect you. So all it takes is one student or one teacher refusing to wear a mask and all the other masks are irrelevant, right? So it's almost like an all or nothing thing. And the podding, I guess, is the only way to deal with that. So at the very least, if one student takes their mask off and sneezes, you're minimizing the spread, right? Because they're not running around the school without a mask on. But because masks are so expensive, and we haven't gotten to this part yet, I mean, what happens if I guess you can't mandate that they wear them. So is it even, and I hate to say this, but is it even worthwhile to make students wear masks? I don't know. I mean, because you're spending tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars on masks, And all it takes is 3 kids not wearing masks, and it's totally, your school shut down, right? Because again, the mask you wear does not protect you, it protects everybody else. So a teacher could diligently wear a mask all year and still be exposed to the virus multiple times because of a student who's not wearing a mask. Again, I feel like I'm like the dark rain cloud raining on everything. But as an authorizer, this worries me. Again, the liability aspect of it, not just from what I recommend to my schools, which I'm leaning toward. I'm understanding a little bit more why DOE is doing what DOE is doing. Like, you can't make recommendations because you are, to a certain extent, then responsible for those recommendations. But I just can't echo enough what Tim is saying, that we need guidance. All of us need guidance from on high, and not on high, but like, someone needs to tell us what we can do and what we can't do, particularly when it comes to this social distancing and the PPE with regards to kids who can barely keep their pants on sometimes.
I just have a quick question. I know the topic has somewhat shifted to masks, but I'm curious about temperature checks. We were talking about this right before. What are folks doing? I love the idea of checking temperatures while they're still in cars, but what are you doing for your bus riders?
Well, back to what I think what Tim said, the major corporations, IPS, I do not believe is mandating temperature checks. So IPS supports our bus routes. So I believe we're going to have to bring kids, what we plan on doing is bringing kids off the bus, one bus at a time. I love the idea of checking in cars, but for the bus riders, we've bought some of the same things, iPads where kids can stand in front of it and it gives you the temperature. And then of course, move them to the area designated if they have a temperature as to not affect, because in my estimation, I believe that we're not going to be allowed to use the cafeteria. So we're planning on how we give food out for breakfast and lunch, how we get that out. So instead of sending them to where a mass load of kids are in the cafeteria, we've got designated areas. But I think arrival is going to take, based on the numbers that I've calibrated, about 42 more minutes longer than normal, because you're going to need to take temperatures before kids come into the building. So that's going to entail pushing school start back, or the academic side of school start back. So that's going to affect the end of the day. It's going to affect everything. So that's the only way that I can think about doing it, is individual buses coming off, because IPS is not going to take the temperatures of them in the buses.
Is anybody thinking about doing temperature checks before they get on the bus?
This is Stephanie Miranda from Lighthouse Academies. We actually have decided to put bus monitors on there employed by Lighthouse to do the temperature checks, because we've seen in the past, once those kids step foot in the door, it is extremely hard to get parents. They won't answer or come pick up their kids. So our plan is to take their temperature right at the bus stop. So then if it is above the 100, we can directly send them back to their parents.
Hey, Marcy.
Yeah, please jump in. I'm reviewing the chat box to make sure I don't miss anything. So please go, Tim.
Okay, just something quick. And I'm going to go to James Darkside, but I think he's being very practical in his comments. I hope schools are developing, like we are. Perhaps it's the only thing we've done concretely that we think is right, a kind of an emergency succession plan. We have gone through all the key staff members and identified others who can step in for 30-day periods if someone gets ill. And we've also listed all the websites, not passwords, but websites that those folks go to for compliance related issues. So we want to be prepared should I become ill, or the CFO, or anybody else. I would strongly recommend that people take that step.
I want to highlight, thank you, Tim, for that. I think that's a really important point. I want to highlight Barbara's suggestion, or what she's doing at Community Montessori, that there's going to be a parent commitment form. If you have that, Barb, I think we'd love to see it, if you don't mind sharing it. That says that I'm assuming it's something that parents will sign at the beginning of the year and send back, maybe, that says that they will do screenings at home, and that may work well in your community. And that sounds like a good streamlined approach. Sorry, and you're saying teachers will screen again within the first 30 minutes of school, and staff are wearing face shields.
Yeah, I put a very rough draft in there. I don't know if the whole thing got in there or not. Anyway, it doesn't look like it did. We just have barely started on it, but I'll put my email address there if anybody wants me to send it.
You can email it to me, maybe.
Okay, I'll do that. But yeah, it's just, for us, we just want to really make families know that if they're bringing their kiddo, here's what you agreed to. And we're trying to find a way to send out all of the parent contacts and emergency contacts. They did an enrollment, and make sure that it's accurate and up to date, and they have to agree to be picking up their kiddo in 1 hour. So there's things like that we're asking them to do before they come to physical school.
Temperature checks. We kind of jumped around to a lot of things. I want to make sure that we still have 30 minutes left in the conversation and plenty of topics we can talk about. I want to make sure before we get way too far, did anyone else want to talk about their pathways that they're looking at for next year, or have questions along those lines or concerns? Another thing we sort of moved past a little bit was the health screenings and procedures for staff and students. We talked a decent amount about that, but just also want to make sure if anyone else has any concerns or questions on that, we touch on those. We talked a decent bit about transportation. I don't know if anyone has any further questions around busing or entering the building. I don't know if distancing on buses is a concern that anyone's got. I don't know if that's even possible. Probably not. There's probably still a lot we can talk about in terms of day-to-day operations. Some folks have touched on cleaning, building cleaning. Tim or Katie or Tommy, is there anything that you guys want to talk about in terms of that?
There's one thing I would jump in on, since we're all looking at cleaning, extensive cleaning and sanitizing. We're having an evaluation of our air systems, our air handlers, our air filtration. We're having a third party come in that we work with on these kinds of things anyway, to take a look. And then we started talking about, in a management meeting recently, we have encouraged for years to have our teachers close their doors to their classrooms. And now I said, I think we're gonna have to open them. And the principals just about tore my eyes out, and I was glad, because they get it, from an active shooter or someone penetrating our building or campus, but they weren't thinking about the air quality and having 12, 13, 15 people in a room and opening the doors so that circulation is better. I reached out to the DOE yesterday, Saturday, it looks like I just got a message back to have a conversation about how school safety is being impacted by this. So if we're trying to protect our buildings from the outside, we actually have an inside enemy right now. It's being carried by children predominantly, and other staff that may have not been diagnosed. So that's a couple pronged comment, but we're looking at air filtration and air circulation systems to make sure they're up to snuff, and then there's an impact on school safety concerning doors.
That's a really good point, Tim. I think if I was holding a forum like this on a super hot topic no less than 1 year ago, it might have been on school safety. So Anybody thought about the trade-offs there, that they have something that they'd like to share?
I know on our end, the process of parents entering the school is going to look a lot different now. That was always a weak point in terms of student and staff safety is end of day parent entry. That's going to have to be a screened entry if it's allowed at all in our situation now. And so I think that's going to increase security because there's going to be more tightly controlled access into the school environment. The other, I kind of think, while it's going to be really confusing at first, one interesting outcome of this is I bet we're going to have the best cold and flu season we've ever had in terms of less cold and flu.
Hope so.
Because we've never been in a situation where we've paid so much attention to disease transfer. So I would imagine the spread will be lower, but the trauma will be higher because one sneeze, one cough, one sniffly nose is going to offset every effort, and it's going to be really hard for staff to power through that and students not to label each other. So we've got a lot of work there.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask what everybody's doing about hydration? Are you literally shutting off your fountains and putting in, are you going to have bottle fillers allowed, or what is everybody doing there?
We're installing bottle fillers in place of a couple of our drinking fountains because you can, bottle fillers are an allowable expense under the nutrition funds. So you can use any of your nutrition profits and code it against that to install bottle fillers.
Just so you know, our health department commissioner said we were not allowed to use bottle fillers. He said it is a common way that the virus gets spread is from the mouth of the water bottle to the water filler. And so he's making us close all of our fountains and water fillers. So we have sinks in every room. We're coming up with some system where they pour it into a pitcher and then pour the pitcher into there, and then or we're going to use plastic cups that they can dispose of, or a way to sanitize the pitcher. So that's what we're working on. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, we've had similar issues with cups. That was the conversation we had a few days ago. Again, we're hearing from MCHD that the concept of bringing something from the home environment into the school environment, especially something that you put your mouth on, is troubling. So we're moving to Dixie cups next to water fountains, but then the math is bad. If every student uses 2 Dixie cups a day, we'd only need 360,000 Dixie cups in a year. That's lean. The other part of that is how do you keep them full? You would need a dispenser in your wall that's taller than your wall to try to handle that. So I feel like we'd need a part-timer just to go around the school and staff Dixie cup dispensers all day. So there's solutions there that we don't have yet, but hydration's key. We should be providing water to our kids. How we get there is not going to be a perfect science.
Yikes. Let me see other issues around. Anybody want to talk about recess extracurriculars? Challenges there, what you're thinking, will they be allowed? I mean, I'm sure recess will be allowed, but what does that look like? And then sporting events and things like that. Tim, Katie, Tommy, anybody care to kick us off there?
Sure. We've got our finger on the pulse of sporting events. We're a pretty avid football school. Our coaches really don't want to hear that we're going to cancel the season, and neither do some of our parents. And so we're really waiting to see if anybody's going to say something higher up the food chain on that. But all other regular extracurriculars will be either limited or put on hold for the time being. Recess is a challenge. I mentioned earlier recess equipment. Most of us don't have the timing built in the day to clean off the recess equipment for every single class, or the great pleasure of having enough recess equipment so only one class can use it at a time. So restructuring what recess looks like, providing enough breaks for cleaning. I mean, to clean off and sterilize an entire set of recess equipment if you don't have a sprayer, it's probably a 20 to 30 minute exercise, but at a sprayer that works in 3 to 5 minutes, but then all the equipment's wet. So it's a tough. We've talked even about not allowing any access to recess equipment, and so at that point, what do? Lay out cones and say, "This is your square. Go stand in it. Enjoy the fresh air." So it's tough to figure that one out and see what's going to be best for kids.
Yeah, so we are revising a master schedule to ensure just one cohort is outside for recess at a time. No access to actual recess equipment. And so trying to get creative around different games we can be equipping our recess monitors to be teaching students that does not allow access to any physical equipment.
Anybody else want to share thoughts or questions or concerns around recess and extracurriculars? For those who have before and after school programs in your buildings that aren't yours directly, how are you handling those?
So I'll just say our health department director believes that the light from sun, which he says is all science, like the UV lights that they're using to sanitize masks and things at hospitals, which I've tried to get UV sanitizers, by the way, and if anyone has any good resources, I'd love to have them. But he says, it's just a few minutes outside, it gets killed by the sun. And so he does not think it's necessary to sanitize or not use any of the equipment. So you can remind kids that they don't touch their mouths and they wash their hands when they come back in, just as an extra precaution. We have lots of wooded areas and things that we utilize. So we at this point are probably going to let them utilize the things, and we'll have sanitizer available outside.
Did anyone have any other thoughts, questions, concerns around food service and how you're doing that? Tommy mentioned that they really want to be using their cafeteria. I think some others are purposely avoiding using the cafeteria. Anybody want to share their thoughts around that?
I'll jump in, Marcy. We're planning on serving, and I get the socialization issue tremendously. The lunch is an important time for the kids to kind of be themselves, but for the time being, we're going to plan on serving the kids in our classroom. We work with Aramark, and probably a number of you do in the Indianapolis area for sure. And we're scheduling a meeting to talk through all kinds of issues relative to that. But we'll be bringing lunches to the classrooms.
Is everyone, I assume, moving to like a prepackaged, like almost like a Lunchable type of situation?
We're trying. We still haven't gotten confirmation that Aramark can pull the trick off at the volume that we've got, but that's what we'd prefer.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what's the other option? Like a traditional kind of buffet style line?
Yeah, and I don't see how that's feasible.
Yeah. Interesting. Other thoughts and concerns around food? What else is on our list? I want to make sure that everybody thinks of other questions or topics. I mentioned earlier and want to return to it, not only for you to share your thoughts now, but really very sincerely to think on it today and let us know what you're thinking later. Number one, in terms of guidance that you still wish for from the state, we certainly can't guarantee that we can make them deliver it, but it would be nice to know what your wish list is at least. And number two, sort of on the opposite side of that, what your wish for flexibilities that you don't currently have is. We know for sure that based on a law that was passed 2 years ago, year 1 or 2 years ago, regardless, that the legislature made a specific effort to say to schools that we are going to offer you the opportunity to ask for waivers from certain things. This would be a really, really good time for us to put our heads together and use that. The state board / IDOE, I believe, currently is coming up with the process that they'll use. But I think this would be we'd be really remiss in not using this opportunity to our advantage, given that we're charters and even in good times, being overregulated is one of our biggest challenges. So if you can think of anything now to put on the list, either in terms of further guidance that you wish you had, and number two, further flexibilities that you wish you had, I'd love to hear about those. And if not, then other concerns on your mind.
And if I can jump in, just because I'm literally 10 feet below the State Board of Education, I would highly recommend that these are all consolidated.
We've asked them if we could even work with a whole team of you to submit things on your behalf. Only who would be interested in working with us, but we would love to play a role in that. And thanks for mentioning that, James.
Yeah, they're going to want to do this to the extent that State Board has the ability to waive certain regulations, and I don't even know if they do, right? I mean, rulemaking is Byzantine. But one ask that is a consolidated ask with the full weight of not just charters, but I'm sure districts behind it will go much, much farther than separate charter asks, separate voucher asks, separate public school asks. So the sooner that somebody, Marcy, can put together some sort of coalition, Marcy, to get these folks together and come to a, because they're constantly asking us as agency heads, what do you need rolled back? Like at the beginning of this whole thing, they were asking, because of course now they're asking us, what can we undo that we undid? So it worries me a little, and I think that goes a little bit back toward the optics. They want everyone to think it's business as usual, so they want to roll back as much of the sort of exceptions. I think the first one to go that will have the most impact for charters is the virtual meetings, which has been invaluable in my estimation. I mean, I've attended more meetings in the last 2 months than I've attended in the previous 3 years. It's just easy. But it also gives school corps, chartered governing boards the ability to really react, to meet way more than they normally would to react to things that they need to address right then and there. And so I'm pushing really hard to extend that as long as possible.
Absolutely.
But just anything else, I strongly suggest that we get it to one point, get it to Marcy, and then it can just be one big ask of State Board. And instead of having individual school waivers, we do blanket waivers to the extent we can.
James, do you know when they plan to have that process public?
I'll reach out to Brian today and ask him.
Thank you. So to that end, any and you might not know yet. It's harder to think off the top of your head about things that you wish didn't apply to you. Are there any other pieces of guidance that you do wish that you had?
This is probably too basic at this point in the conversation, but in terms of mandates of things I would have liked to have seen from higher up, I would rather have been mandated for social distancing or crowd control of any kind. And certainly if we get into the idea of who's got the right to get temperature checked or deny temperature checks or screenings, where does the law stop there? And back to James's earlier point about the liability of infection within our school buildings, that liability has been passed on to us with no guidance from up above. And the other one is attendance, looking at attendance rates. Can there be a waiver for attendance, or I know in the ME report, we're now counting at COVID-19, but it seems to be a stopgap and not a permanent solution there. Redefining contact hours, 5 and 6 hours is great, but how does it cross apply on site and off site?
Well, DOE did put out a little bit of guidance on that I think, if that's addressing what your concern is, Tommy, on Friday as well, that said something to the effect that you're required to go 80 days and you're required to have X amount of hours per school, like X amount at the elementary level, X amount of hours at the high school level. But just so you know, we only collect information on days. Kind of leaving it to you, I think, is what they're trying to say, that just do what you can do, what makes sense to do. Did that help? Did that make you feel a little bit better?
Well, it's again putting the accountability on me without a guideline from up above, and so yeah, it makes me feel better if the choice I make is the right one. But just clarifying that means more to me.
On the attendance side, you're held to that by your authorizer primarily, right? Is that your main concern there?
Aren't there ESSA guidelines on attendance too?
Yes, there are, but I don't know what the consequences are.
Isn't that related to testing, or is that a state guidance? I don't know. The 180 days does not apply to charter schools, right? I mean, everyone knows that.
Right.
Okay.
That's right. Thanks.
I know that the CFIG funding that just came out through ESSA, I think, was weighting attendance as one of the annual attendance rates as one of the measures for reaching funding there. It's not the only measure, but some of those federal grants look at it.
Well, attendance flexibility, then maybe that's something that we ask the state for flexibility in how they address maybe the state has a plan, if that's allowable, perhaps, I don't know.
I think it would be useful for me if someone were to tell, like, I'm not even sure, I know we measure it as part of our accountability system, but I am unfamiliar, as you're mentioning a grant, Tommy, that takes it into account, but I don't know where else it's taken into account. It would be useful for me to know that, like, in terms of just trying to figure out things that we would need waivers from, it's identifying what the issues are first. I know we're already making plans to basically discount attendance in our accountability framework, just because there's no point at this juncture. I mean, we took a survey of our schools, and their attendance rates estimated during the continuous learning period were like from 22% to 90 to 100%, all over the map. And a lot of it completely depended on, the individual circumstances of the school. Now, hopefully they'll be better than 20% next year, but still, they're not going to be 98%.
We are shockingly running out of time. The conversation has seemed like it's gone really fast. There are a number of questions and points in the chat. I think there seems to be some questions around when and if Marion County will be giving guidance. I don't know the answer to that exactly. It seems like some folks on the call, or I keep saying that on the chat, might have better information than I do. We'll certainly pass on anything that we learn, though. I think we maybe check the box on the question about instructional time. Any other questions that you have, or major topics that we should consider covering? And I'll say this too, I'm happy to convene a group with or without some leaders to kind of guide the discussion on any regular basis, any amount of time that you would want. If you just want to come see a group of your peers like this and keep discussing questions that you have, if that's of interest to you, maybe just send up this thumbs up sign, or type a little message to me, because I'd be happy to do that for folks that are still interested. But any other questions that you want to throw in, even if I can't answer them now, I'll do my best to get answers back to people as soon as we can. Or any other closing thoughts from Tim, Katie, or Tommy that we haven't touched on?
I have kind of a non sequitur question. So if you want to shelve it, I can ask you, Marcy, later. You might give me some feedback. But I'm trying to give feedback to my board about whether or not teachers are getting raises next year, given the budget constraints. So I'm just curious as to if you all have where you are with that. Are you giving no raises at all, 0 increases, or are teachers getting, do you anticipate trying to build in something given obviously the very dire budget situation?
Yeah, we started making changes on the admin level, flatlining salaries. I think because the funding is more secure for us this year than it's likely to be in future years,
right.
It's going to be a big part of our message in pre-service in August for the rest of the staff that we're going to need to be responsive to what the state does, and that could mean that we're going to see a change in budgeting for the organization. We're also decreasing our anticipated per pupil funding starting next year in our budgeting process to try to make sure we're staying conservative in that. And same effect as we model any virtual program, to James's point, we're modeling it at 85%. So if we do come through at 100, it's a big win for us, but at least we're not going to be submarine through that.
If I can really quick address one question from Julie. She's saying, can you please point me to the 180 requirement waiver? It's more complicated than that. It literally is because the statute just simply does not apply to charter schools. There's no waiver requirement. The 180-day requirement simply doesn't apply to charter schools, period. DOE finally, for the first time in my memory, acknowledged that this year by refusing, or not refusing, but not requiring charters to file the waivers, the 20-day waiver documents. They were returning them and saying, you're a charter school, it doesn't apply to you. That's the first time I've ever seen IDOE. I've always thought that was the case, but that's the first time I've seen IDOE actually acknowledge it in writing. So it literally just, there's no waiver process, it just is inapplicable. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, everybody. This has been an awesome conversation. It's moved around a lot of places. If you have, over the next couple days or this week, as you keep working on your plans, if you think of additional questions that might be well answered by this group, again, either feel free to send them to me or feel free to request or suggest that we do another meeting like this in a week or two or a month or whatever. I'm happy to throw something together for folks if it's helpful in the future. We're going to take a 5 or so minute break before our last session, and we'll commence at about 11, a little after 11:30, 11:35. Thank you so much to Tim, to Katie, to Tommy, and to James for being resources for us. You guys were really, really helpful, and to take extra time to put together some thoughtful thoughts in advance of this. Thank you to all of you for participating, and we'll see you again in a couple minutes. Begin our last session today. Thanks in advance for all those who've stuck it out for 3 conversations. It's a lot of thinking for a Monday morning. But with that, we will stop thinking about all the craziness we have in front of us for just a few minutes and think back to what weirdly may even seem like a simpler time already this past spring, where we can think back about what we tried that worked, what we tried that maybe wasn't quite on the mark, that we had to reevaluate and change, and hopefully what you can take from all of that moving forward into the coming year. So we've got an excellent panel of folks to help us cover that topic in an hour. To help me moderate is Jamie Garwood, Dr. Jamie Garwood, who's the director of the Office of Charter Schools at Ball State. And our school leaders helping us today are 2 leaders from 2 different sets of schools. Ann Davis, who's the Senior Director of Goodwill Education Initiative, so overseeing all of their schools all over Central Indiana. And then Corey Emery, who's a Regional Director with the Excel Center, so he's working with a subset of schools. Again, they see a lot of geographic diversity within that set of schools. And then we have Kiana Warren and Shatoya Ward, who are with the Purdue Polytechnic high school group. Kiana works with the North Side, the Broad Ripple campus, and Shatoya leads the downtown campus. So we've got some excellent folks. And as we've done with the last 2 sessions, I've got a list of topics that I think are going to be on the top of folks' minds in terms of concerns. But please jump in at any point to move the conversation where you need it to go to be helpful. I will start asking some questions to our panel. So, so thinking about what worked and what didn't, let's shift our mind. We've been talking a lot about operations previous to this, but let's get back to like the part, the really important part, the student instruction. What did you all try that worked and that didn't work that you had to shift around as far as student instruction? Maybe Purdue folks, you guys want to start?
Sure. So I think everybody was in the same boat when we were thinking about things to transition to in the light of the uncertainty and the speediness of the decisions being made. So we decided to transition all of our sessions into technology, which is we use Google Hangout. And some of the things that we learned, lessons that we learned as if all, is technology and access was some of the challenges for our families to engage in their sessions. And so we had to work very diligently in making sure that, our staff, our students, and our families had internet access. We had to make sure that our staff, students, and families had all the hardware that was needed. And so I know some districts went to iPads. We are a one-to-one anyway, but we also, the major thing to that was, even though we were one-to-one, we had to figure out pathways for our students to get access to anything, what we call technology issues. So if their Chromebook broke in and they needed a new Chromebook, if the internet wasn't working on their Chromebook, things of the sort, there's always technology issues that we had to work through. And so it took everybody hands on deck, not just our tech support person, to aid in making sure that our students had the available hardware. So I'm gonna start off with that challenge, but I'm gonna let some other panelists talk through some of the lessons that they learned when it came down to instruction.
One thing that we really learned early on was it was necessary to have the right mix of asynchronous and synchronous instruction. And one of the things about asynchronous that became absolutely necessary is when we were working with our high school students, some of them had responsibilities taking care of their younger siblings. So we made sure that each child had an individualized plan that allowed them to be successful when they needed, when they were able to and had that level of support. Another thing we learned is a lot of students were just feeling like, I miss my friends, I miss that personal connection. So we really learned that they, so every morning we have what's called PLC, the personal learning communities. And during that time, we built in a lot of SEL support and just work overall. But students, we were having such high attendance at those sessions just because students really needed that level of support and interaction with their peers. That wasn't just simply we're doing math together, but we're discussing the work. Another thing that's really unique about our program is we're project-based. And we learned that continuing our project while we transitioned into the e-learning platform was really great for student engagement. And some of the things we had to do on the back end to make sure that was possible was we had to send out certain kits for like chemistry class so that students were doing their hands-on projects. Though they were connected virtually, they still were able to work using their hands and using inquiry-based instruction. So it wasn't simply like going from these really cool projects to just doing online boring work. We knew that we had to bring what is special to our school. And I truly believe that's why we had most days over a 90% attendance rate.
Kiana, I have a question for you. Were you able to still do those project-based activities as collaborative? Were students still doing those together as teams? And how did you do that? Or did they do that independently?
It's a great question. We had a mixture of both. And this allowed for students even more voice and choice within the students. But there were some students where they just literally did the projects all at the same time. And there was a teacher who was doing the projects along with them. Whatever that looked like. But there were some students where that didn't work for, and that was okay as long as they could take a video of them doing the same work and we could check that. So we really tried to make it work for the students' individual needs.
And I think to add to that, the value was being able to assess student work in a variety of methods. And so it wasn't a matter of just, online tests and quizzes per se, but like a video or music or, they were able to work with the teacher for a little minute. I like how she talked about asynchronous versus synchronous. There was a time where they all gathered. Then there was a time where they all split off in groups in the same timing of that session, where there was no teacher who facilitated. They did their own facilitation, and then they came back to the group. The teachers were very innovative in how to deliver the methods of projects, but they also were very innovative in the variety of methods to be able to assess student learning.
Excel and Goodwill team, what about you in terms of lessons you learned around instruction?
Corey's going to jump in, but I'll jump in. I'll jump in first, then I'll just hand off to Corey. One of the things we learned was we anticipated that we didn't know what students would want, and I think the biggest piece would be for us was trying to make sure we planned for every option since instruction is face-to-face. So trying to figure out, did students want paper packets to do? Did they want online? Knowing that the average age for our Excel Center adult high schools is 29. We know some people are more comfortable or less comfortable with technology. So just trying to maximize opportunities for our students for what was most comfortable. And in that, we found that students were much more comfortable with technology than the paper packets, even though we planned for that. And making sure that we had, regardless of which option we were looking at, whether it was creating those paper packets or the online opportunities, that we were making sure to build in for our special populations all of their accommodations, any services or supports they needed, making sure that they still had access to all of those things, translating materials and access to tutors and supports as needed. And then Corey can probably talk about how that was built out, the way we were able to pivot to make sure we did that really quickly, because I think that was critical to making sure we were ready to go.
Yeah, thanks, Ann. I think our last day of in-person instruction, I was actually in Kiana's building being interviewed by one of her students for one of the projects she discussed. Yeah, from a timings perspective, the Excel Center works on 5 accelerated semesters, essentially. And we were about to wind down our 4th, going into a 2-week student spring break. So we had plenty of time following the completion of that term. We had 30 volunteers from across our 15 schools, and they rebuilt our existing curriculum maps within our LMS that delivers credit recovery. So system that was familiar, that's already been vetted for accessibility across a variety of platforms, and had all of that ready to go in paper or virtual form by the time that 5th term began. I think one of the biggest challenges we found were the folks who chose to do it virtually using a device, whether it was ours or theirs, was they were balancing connectivity within the home. As Ann said, our average age is 29. Over 50% of our students are parents of school-age children. And so when their kids were completing work, probably some of you were assigning, the priority for the device was their child. And our student would be able to log on for asynchronous instruction later, at a later time. And so connectivity was an interesting one, though we found that folks who did have a device were completing work far more regularly than paper. And I'm curious if that was consistent for those who did both, But yeah, that was our experience.
What do you think? Can anyone answer Corey's question about where did you have better completion rates versus for online versus packet type work? Okay, perhaps somebody will type that in if they think of something to add. Anne touched on it, but I want to ask specifically about your the support you gave to special populations, and how were there things that worked well, things that didn't work well, that you kind of figured out over the course of the end of this semester? I see Shatoya nodding, so I'll ask you.
I think one of the things that worked well for us was I heard Corey talk about tutors. And so we had quite a bit of volunteers of tutors who were able to provide that one-on-one with our special population. They were able to give them guidance, whether it's with technology or their content or within the project. So they were able to give that one-on-one attention to our special population, which was a great deal. Then also, I think, and this is probably, I get a lot of flack for this, but just having a very good connection with parents. Parents have been very cooperative with helping us support their student, telling us what their needs are, and also connecting us to supports for their student as well. They were able to give us advice on the special technology that could aid their student within their home. They were able to give us advice on the best timing to be able to give synchronous instruction to the special population. So just having that connection and listening to the parents was very key to us providing a quality education.
One thing I want to add as well, one of the gifts of social distancing, if I can't even say that, is that it kind of freed up some of our teacher of record, it freed up their time to where they were actually able to do more one-on-one with the students on their caseload. And I would say actually more of our PORs were able to figure out a way to double the amount of time. So not simply just following what's in the IEP, but giving them more individualized attention, which to me was a gift. One thing that we also employed while social distancing and wearing masks and keeping 6 feet away is we did home visits. Not just for our special populations, but there were, because we serve we serve marginalized populations, so we made sure they were getting the basic necessities like food and things like that. But if we didn't hear from a student in 2 days, we showed up at their homes, and that was really effective as well.
Kiana, it's interesting that you say that about being able to get to know students better. In my experience at Ball State with the virtual schools that we authorize, and they do this every day, they're full-time virtual schools, but time and time again when I've talked to teachers over the years, teachers who have worked in brick and mortar, teachers who have worked both brick and mortar and virtual, they always tell me that they're able to get to know their students better. And because, and I think a lot of it's because they can focus on that student and not all of the other distractions that go on in a school. And the analogy that I often give is, if you think about something like Facebook and all your Facebook friends around the country, family members around the country, you probably know more about them than you would without social media. Maybe that's good or bad. But, if you think about things like if you have a family member who moved into a new home and they live in California, or they have you have a niece in Florida who's in a dance rehearsal or something, you get to see things about people's lives that, you might not otherwise, have that opportunity. So that's my analogy. When you think about it with students, you can connect to students, through online platforms, through phone calls, the video chatting, things like that. It's not the same, but I think it can have the potential to help teachers get to know their students a little better.
Jamie, to follow up on that, do you know any aside from connections, which you helped them share a lot of their knowledge with the whole charter school ecosystem in Indiana throughout the spring? Do you have anything else stick out to you from any of the other schools in your portfolio about real successes that they had, either just with instruction generally or with special populations?
Well, I think that, and this is kind of part of the connections presentations that we did, one of the things that came out of that was, particularly on the ELL session that we did, there were really good resources that were shared, not just by the connections folks, but also schools that were participating, you know, around the state. And I did go and update that presentation to include a lot of the different resources that other schools shared. So I can include that too in the chat box. I'll include a link to that. But I was really impressed by those resources that were shared. And while we talked about them in the context of ELL, they weren't unique to just ELL. I think that they were good tools, you know, that any teachers could be using, you know, for their instruction. So I thought I was real impressed with the tools people found. Teachers did a really good job of trial by fire troubleshooting, trying to figure out, you know, what worked. So I thought that was, you know, a good outcome. And, you know, and I think that, you know, but we did have also teachers that were challenged with maybe not being so tech savvy. And I think that that's definitely something going forward that we all need to think about, what kind of supports to provide for teachers, you know, in trying to teach online.
So I feel really bad doing this. You can totally just say no thanks, but I see Julie Gruhl from Daymar, which is an all special populations campus. So I'm just going to ask Julie if she has any words of wisdom that she wants to share from serving her students virtually. And you're muted, Julie, so you feel free if you don't want to share with us to stay muted, but we'd love to hear you.
I will unmute. I've had kids and dogs in and out, so I was trying to save everybody from that, but thank you. As you said, 99% of our students qualify, and so that is our focus. I think what we found through this, as many of you said, trying to provide every possible option. You know, we have the virtual, but there, of course, were issues with connectivity for students. I know our director went around literally, as someone else mentioned, with the masks and dropping off hotspots and, you know, devices and trying to make sure that everyone in the home had something to access that. But even then, just for working levels of some of our students and talking about some of those most severe, how we could try to make that. And so putting together daily activities and functional academics and those types of things, and then checking in with the families. But, you know, we had packets as well, but I think we really had the most success regardless of the type of delivery of instruction for those teachers who had already a really strong relationship with the families. And so I think, you know, we got the best participation. I was in the office last week and one of the teachers' mailboxes had a stack like this big of packets that had actually been dropped off or mailed back in. And, you know, in all honesty, we didn't necessarily expect that we would get that from some of these families, but we did. And that particular teacher, you know, regularly, and it was mostly phone calls because tech savvy is not a term to describe this particular teacher, but he's very engaged with the students. And so, you know, and we had some that did the online platforms and they got better participation again if they had already been more engaged with families. So I guess really that's just what we found worked for us, is that relational piece.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that.
So Marcy, I have a question for everyone really on as it relates to instruction. As you look forward to the new school year and you may have job openings, are there skill sets that you're now looking for that you maybe didn't think as much about before? What would those be?
It's a really good question. I think for us, we're always looking for folks who are super passionate about the mission we serve and the students we serve. And that typically can carry us quite a ways. And then a lot of times the character traits we're looking for after that tip, and these are not hard skills. It's someone who's highly flexible, highly adaptable, has a breadth of experience serving the folks that we do, that can adapt in any environment. We typically move really fast in an Excel Center school year. Like I said before, it's 5 semesters. Your teaching assignments can change, your caseloads can change. And so that's who we're looking for. And I think as I pondered your question, it would just be a doubling down of that, right? Like, how did you survive wherever you were during COVID, and how do you think that would apply here? And for a new teacher, are you ready for a fast changing environment?
This, Tim Mulheron, just a comment on staff overall, especially administrative staff. During the fourth quarter was fascinating, not meeting together. And I got to tell you, as the CEO, I felt quite this interesting sense of insecurity and nervousness and anxiety, because the building I'm managing, the buildings I'm responsible for, and the children I'm responsible for, and staff I'm responsible for, they weren't anywhere around me. And so it was an interesting place to be. And what we learned through our interactions through Zoom and Google Meet is that if you need to have very strong collaborative and communication skills to really do well in this type of environment in particular. And we've also been coaching teachers as needed on some of those things. So it fleshed out some people who are really struggling with communication. Brief emails don't cut it, or not saying anything in a Zoom meeting don't cut it. You really have to explain yourself and be concise and precise. So we found that our meeting productivity picked up eventually once we started recognizing these things. We even have one person who's an executive, there's only a couple of us here, who decided based on some feedback that he needed to work on emailing skills and is getting some coaching on that in a formal way. So I just want to comment on that. I mean, teachers typically should be pretty strong communicators or shouldn't be in the business, but the administrative side sometimes gets ignored for the similar talents that they have that we need to have as well.
And I will even add on to Tim's when you talk about adjustment and leadership for administration and for teachers. What we found too is we had to create touch points for our teachers, and where we usually have, once a month teacher meetings or such, we learned that we need to have multiple, more. We had to add. So we met with our teachers daily just to talk through what the logistics look like for the day. We call it a stand-up, so it's about 15 minutes. But to answer all their questions on what the uncertainties are of the decisions that has been made, it just jumped on real quick. We talked through what's going on. We answered their questions. We talked about logistics, and then they were going through their day. So we found that we had to make adjustments on even the touch points. Some of it through email, but they value, just like we're doing right now in Zoom, looking at each other in our faces and having this conversation. They valued being able to see what's going on, seeing each other, and having these conversations, and that increased productivity for our students and for our.
One of the things that I read as we were all getting bombarded with lots of different research and documents about online learning was that most active principals in schools today have never taught an online lesson. And so they're now tasked with trying to lead a school, evaluate teachers, be the curriculum leaders of their school, but they may not have experience actually teaching a lesson online. So one of the things I really encouraged principals to do was pick up a lesson for one of your teachers, teach some of these classes, so that they would have that experience themselves. And I think that would allow principals to be a better support. So I'm curious in the chat box if any principals did that. Did you teach any classes for your teachers or co-teach so that you would have the same experiences that they do?
Most definitely. I would say I've picked up not just a lesson, but I had a class for the cycle, and we have accelerated cycles as well, or semesters, as Corey put. And so I picked up a PLC, which is a personalized learning community, which traditionally would be known as an advisory. I picked up one of those, and I picked up a class just to be able to feel what my teachers are feeling, and then also to be able to find the best, like I was able to contribute to the conversations of what worked best for me and the lessons that I was able to learn as well, like what didn't work and what I failed at. And I shared with our coaches, and then I learned from the coaches as well. And I was able to take hold of what they were saying. So yeah, I did take on just for a time period of what that looks like, so I can feel their pain and their joys.
I think also related to the school piece is any of the team members at your school that are doing kind of the behind the scenes things. So whether it's people that you're, you know, at the front desk or the office manager, or anybody who's not working face to face with your students, I think in thinking about those teams, you know, we did a lot of pivoting this year. How can we think about doing our work differently so it allows the school-based folks or the people who are face-to-face, our teachers, face-to-face with our students every day, to really focus 100% of their energy on the students and what they need, so that we can take additional things off teachers' plates to make sure that they're focusing on their students. Because I think that was one of the key pieces with COVID, is no one knew what to expect, no one knew what was happening next. And so for any of our other support areas to be able at GEI to be able to look at how can we pivot or how can we provide other options for schools so that they can focus all their energy on meeting their students' needs during that time and not having to worry about any of the administrative things or other pieces that they typically might have handled at the building. So thinking about flexibility, when we're talking about hiring, thinking about people who think of lots of options and are able to pivot very easily, so that whatever is needed at the school for your students, that can be your #1 priority, and everyone is kind of circled around the schools to make sure that that's happening in the way it needs to for student success.
That's awesome. Some of it was very convenient to be able to do with inviting some of that back end office into the sessions of our teachers. I love that we had a lot of our sessions online. So if we use a Google Hangout for a session, anybody in our school can chime in and see what's going on. And so it wasn't a matter of going in to evaluate, but it was a matter of going in to see how teachers are delivering this instruction, and then how are our students responding to it. And man, they received great insight, and it aided in being able to support them in the back end as well. And they were also part of the conversations of what worked and what didn't, and what their observations were to be able to support us.
If anyone has any other questions or thoughts to share around instruction, please feel free. But I think that we may be ready to shift. I think Kiana was the one who touched the most so far on social and emotional supports that were needed, provided, you know, things that you adapted for the online environment. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more specifically about that and what you've learned over the course of the time at home about how to serve those needs of your students well.
So I can start with this one. One of the things that we learned really early on in the school year is like your social emotional learning is not just for your students, but it's for your staff as well, because they can't pour from an empty cup. So as Shatoya talked about before, just having those check-ins with staff, we had times where we got together with our teams in a social way, where it wasn't just academic and we were really talking to each other. After the incidents that happened with George Floyd and some other things, we had to have sessions of healing and talking through what that means for our students. And we had to talk about how to support our students through that while we ourselves were hurting and concerned. One of the things I love about our school model is we're set up to have right now we have RNs in both of our buildings, and we also have a social emotional learning counselor who only focuses on that work and have the expertise and background to make sure that they can support our students. We made sure to continue to run all of the SEL programming that was happening. We made sure that our students had touch points with the school counselor and with the school nurse. And SEL for us isn't just about, you know, a period of the day, but it's actually wrapped in everything that we do, whether it's coaching students during their instructional time or during time that's like we have clubs. So we had a cooking club, so students were getting together and baking the same stuff at the same time, and it was really powerful for them. We even had a cosmetology club, which isn't something that you would expect at a tech school, but it was really important for some of our students to get together because you can't go to the spa. So have a spa day together. So that was really cool. Our nurse taught some yoga classes so that students were able to do that mindfulness, and she's certified and knows how to do those type of things. So I think one of the things that I've learned over time from this year is social emotional learning needs to be proactive and not just reactive. You don't just wait until a student has a blow up and you're like, oh, we should have done something. Just really having those things in place and making sure you're actually surveying both your students and your staff to see, so you always have a good pulse on the climate of your SEL culture.
Anything that you guys want to share from the Excel side?
I think.
Yeah,
go ahead,
sorry.
Corey. Yep, jump in.
Yeah, I think I can double down on a lot of what Kiana just said. I think additionally, we really push a pretty high expectation of staff, and we heard a lot of feedback from it, but we thought it was important to make sure students were getting contacted multiple times a day. And across the network of 15 schools and 4,200 students, we were averaging 30,000 points of contact per week, just to make sure we were staying as connected as possible. And that's a variety of means, of course, emails, phone calls, texts, all the ways we reach them. We also, in preparation for the summer and leading into next school year, we did a needs assessment that really looked at trying to determine what barriers students were expecting to face over the summer, so that we could either reach critical needs throughout the summer with some of our support partners in Goodwill, but also be ready for them when we come back in July. And then right now, I think Ann and I's major focus, along with everyone in central office, is to make sure we're protecting the summer break of our staff. With the in-class document dropping last week, and all of the day-to-day updates from the governor, we've just been trying to build and create a cohesive plan and protect their summer as best as possible. We've not had to reach out to them yet, trying to stay disconnected. As Kiana said, they could fill their cup up this summer.
I think for Indy Met, I also wanted to add in that, we have, as an alternative to high school, we have tiered levels of support. So we have a social emotional specialist working with students in tiers 2 and 3, as well as the whole school. And so when we were focused on, we were not with each other physically because of COVID, that specialist was then making sure to do proactive activities throughout that time that students were not physically in the building, just to help support those students. And I love what Kiana said, fill their cup. And then the other piece of that was, because we wanted to make sure students felt safe and their families were whole throughout this time, that specialist then also, there's someone that during the school day, when everyone was face-to-face, they would be responding to kind of at the moment SEL needs throughout the building. And so that person took on attendance during COVID for follow-up, because we wanted to make sure that students felt like if there were attendance follow-ups, it was about taking care of their needs and the social emotional pieces, and not worried that somebody's following up because of attendance because you've done something wrong or because you're not involved enough, but making sure that the school is being proactive about what that family needs. And so we were doing a lot with barrier removal, but then also as family situations changed throughout COVID, making sure that we were getting information as timely as possible so that we could provide whatever services and supports or access to those things as possible. So that person then pivoted their role to make sure that they were staying engaged with all of our families and making sure they had whatever they needed.
Just one more quick thing to add. I know as a leader of a building, I would crash my team's meetings that were happening within the building, walk into a class, sit for a while. Zoom made that far easier to do across 15 schools in the network. Just to find a link that didn't have a password and Zoom bomb folks and just sit and chat for a little while and then bounce out. If you're not doing that, it's a pleasant surprise nearly every time for the team you drop in on, and just saying, hey, how are you guys doing? Do you need anything from me? And bounce out. Is always appreciated across the network.
I want to ask Jamie or anyone on the call who serves elementary grades. We heard these folks mostly serve older students, so I'd love to hear if you have any especially great tips for what works well SEL for younger kiddos.
So I think one of the things that was particularly for the elementary kids, you know, this was really scary for little kids. It was scary for all of us. You know, there's a lot of fear of the unknown, and little kids don't always have the language to be able to communicate that. So, I mean, I think that a lot of schools try to really work with kids on trying to process what their fears were about what was happening. You know, look, all of us as even adults, we learned terms that we say social distancing now like it's no big deal. We didn't talk like that, you know, a few months ago. So trying to help kids, you know, have some language around, you know, being able to articulate how they felt about what was going on, questions they had. They may have had a parent who had lost their job. There's just a whole lot of things that, you know, little kids were really had a lot of anxiety about. So I think talking with kids, one of the things that wasn't a school thing, but one of the things I really loved was Sesame Street doing these town halls for families so that, you know, the Sesame Street puppets communicated with kids about their fears. So, but I think that just goes back to that same thing about having the language to talk to kids about what their fears were. And the older kids, and you all know, our high school folks here know the older kids had their own fears, right? Their high school experience wasn't looking the same. So, you know, they had anxieties about graduation, about prom, about just the high school experience. And so, you know, I'm hopeful that in this fall, should we have to pull kids back out again or things look a little different, at least we have developed some familiarity with what's happening. And that I think will help kids, you know, and us as adults will help, you know, we won't have so much of that fear of the unknown.
Please feel free to again speak up and share if you have any more SEL related tips or tricks or things that you learned that worked well. But another thing I want to make sure to hit is community partnerships and resources for families, for staff. How did you lean on those? How did you leverage those, I guess I would ask, in a whole new way?
Yeah. Oh, Kiana, go for it.
No, Corey, please.
Thanks. I know a major part of the outcomes of the Excel Center is making sure a vast majority of our graduates graduate with a dual credit or a certification. And so all of our certification providers were really flexible with either assessment or instruction. We had a couple CNA providers switch to distance learning, which was a big curve for them, and we supported them in our buildings and outside of our buildings. I know working with peers and making sure that live remote proctoring for their exams was successful. We were hand in hand with them throughout. We had our farm tech provider move everything online into Google Classroom, created a Facebook group to make sure our students could stay connected to them. And I think from a community standpoint, we just, all of our certification providers stepped up and did a really good job. I think to put a bow on that. Kiana?
So we have some really amazing community partners as well. One of the things that we partnered with some really great churches out in the community, and we were able to work with them to deliver fresh groceries to our families, which is really important when you think about nutrition, and some of our families had to transition from working to not working. And so it was really important to fill those key needs. One of my favorite partners and is Purdue University. And we just had a lot of, they're awesome, by the way. And it's not just because I graduated from there, they were awesome before. But we got a lot of resources from them. They were one of the first universities to come out and say, here's a pathway for reopening. So just learning from them and what they have to offer. And honestly, Shatoya talked about before about some of the tutor volunteers. The majority of our tutors actually came from Purdue University. And so boiler up.
I'll also say,
no, go ahead.
Sorry. One of the key components of our instructional model is to relate to the community. We involve the community in our student day. They're engaged in our projects. And so This lended to, we were able to connect with the community locally, but also we opened the classroom up worldwide. We were able to communicate and connect with experts that are in other countries. And you know what? The crazy thing is, because of COVID, they didn't have anything else to do but to be at home. And so we provided an outlet for them to be able to engage with our students. And so we've been very creative in involving and engaging the community locally, nationwide, worldwide, in the instruction of our students. And it's just lended well, just like we are right now. And I'm sure we all at different places in the state. It's lended very well to be able to have our students engage with that expert and hear their sides of what we're working on.
One of the community partners that I think all of you probably utilized was your local health departments. And I just, kudos to them, because from my conversations with school leaders around the state, I think they felt like they were really supported by their local health departments. When the health departments were convening schools, they included the charter schools, they included the private schools, which often doesn't happen in many of our communities across the state. Those charter schools aren't always considered on par and as equal peers to their district counterparts. So I thought that the health departments did an outstanding job of providing guidance and resources to schools. I think the food distribution was a really positive step through the State Department of Education, as well as local community partners, food banks. I know in my community, the YMCA did a food distribution. So, a lot of organizations, I think, really stepped up on the food distribution piece. And I think, one of the great community partners were all of the, other programs like museums, NASA, people like that, organizations like that who did virtual tours online, had tons of programming that was available. They really stepped up and tried to provide teachers with some resources that they could share with kids so that they could visit places and they could see, outer space, or they could go to a museum or go to a zoo, things like that. I think those were also community partners that were really essential. I'm sure a lot of schools utilize resources like that.
I'd love to hear in chat box, or if anyone speak up, if you had a really unique community partnership that was really helpful to your school, something that might give folks a new idea of a place to look in the future. If not, we might turn to, well, I don't know, maybe a final topic, but I definitely want you all to be thinking about if you have other thoughts or other questions for these schools or any of your other colleagues that we haven't touched on yet. But it's a little bit boring now in comparison to, I think, all the things that we've talked about, but unfortunately, operations, very necessary. Anything operations wise that had to, obviously lots of things, but particularly notable things that you had to shift and what proved to be really helpful shifts.
I think this is quite a boring subject, honestly, or what I'm about topic, but attendance. I found that it was really important so I talked to some of my colleagues who are also school leaders, and they decided to go the route of, if I don't hear from you, I'm counting as present. And I found that taking really accurate attendance helped us really figure out which students needed those special contacts. But we had to alter how we did attendance in a way. So we took attendance first thing in the morning, but we also had additional opportunities if for some reason students had other responsibilities. And that really helped us figure out who we were actually in contact. And in return, I really think that really helped our outcomes with students' credit awards and things like that. So I would definitely say, look at how you're taking attendance and shift it a little bit, but make sure you're still taking accurate attendance and not just saying, giving packets and just saying, if I don't hear from them, they're counted absent, or excuse me, they're counted present.
I'll also add to that we needed to be mindful of, as we just talked about, the social emotional
minds of our parents and our students. And so we had just, I mean, think about this, like right now we are in our homes and people are able to see what's going on in your home right now. You hear dogs, you hear kids, you just all kind of things that are going on. I mean, my son just left and he said, "Mom, I'm on my way to work. I love you." And I said, "Hey, I love you too. I'm in this panel." And so we had to think through those things when we were talking about our grading policies, because that was a matter of our students being engaged. As we talked about, they had other responsibilities like watching their siblings or taking care of, other chores that's in the home that they probably wouldn't have had if they were at school. So we had to adjust our grading policies just to account for the intimacy of what technology brings.
And one more really quick thing to add to that, one thing that we really had to look at, and I will say is a lesson learned, it was a struggle for me personally, was enrollment and student engagement of new students, like trying to recruit for new students. We really had to change those practices. And that is something that is just necessary in the charter world.
So I have an operations question for all of you as it relates to technology. Were there things that you had to do to put in place to address student privacy issues or other student safety concerns, shifting programming online? What were things that you had to do differently or policies you had to put in place?
I'm going to get these acronyms wrong, but FERPA and HIPAA. I guess that's what you want to talk through. Okay, because you see a lot in a home, right? And you want to share it, especially if it's something that is troubling to you, right? The first thing you want to do is just go share it with someone. And so we had to talk through the policies of like, listen, FERPA and HIPAA. I think I said HIPAA, is still informed here. So if there is a situation that you feel that is challenging, I know I see y'all cracking up, and I'm going to mess it up a whole lot of times when I say this, so just crack up. But if there is a situation that you feel that is challenging that you actually see, then the policies it continues on as if you saw it in school. So you still have to, contact the right people so that we can protect their privacy. Along with that. And so that was one of the issues. I'm sure there's others, but that was one of major issues that we had dealt with. And then some of the challenges wasn't even challenges that we could work through. Some of those challenges wasn't illegal. They were just uncomfortable. And so we have to be mindful that sometimes our students live in uncomfortable environments. There was pests involved and as such. And it's not illegal. We can report it, but there's really nothing we could do for that. So we had to talk through what that looks like with our staff as well.
Right. And to add another acronym to the list, we had a lot of internal discussion about if we're giving them devices and we're giving them hotspots, how much control should we have over what they access? Right? Do we blacklist the whole internet and open up just a few things we want them to see? And we were able to find hotspots with SIPO filters built in and be able to control our devices from afar as we had those discussions ongoing. So that was a huge discussion for us. And Anne, I think I cut you off.
You just beat me to it, that's all. But I just want to echo what Shatoya said as far as, the safety issue and making sure students are safe and they're not in dangerous situations. And it's, it's a whole level of, students were then kind of inviting us into their homes in a way different than many of us had seen. And so it's looking out for their safety in a way that's really just that due diligence is not the right word, because we do it from the heart because we care about our students. That's why we're all in the field we are in, and there becomes a legal obligation that goes with it. But I think Shatoya just said it so well, and I'm sure that weighed on so many of us as we were conducting Zooms and other things with our students and seeing things we may have had ideas of or may have known but not seen in person. And so I just thank Shatoya for naming that so well.
Is there anything operations wise that you saw from your kind of your like bird's eye view as an authorizer, Jamie, that common challenges that people faced?
Myself. One of the, I guess, operationally, I think board governance was a big issue. Just schools trying to figure out how to do that now. through Zoom meetings or things like that. Lotteries, that was another one that came up as, you know, something that schools were trying to figure out if they should do it online, if they should try to postpone it, what should they do? So I'm also curious in the chat box if anyone had some lessons learned as it relates to your lottery, and how you did that successfully. You know, we had schools, you know, looking at, do they do it like Facebook Live? Do they do it through Zoom? Do they record it? Do they, you know, how do they manage maintain the privacy of students? Because that was, you know, another issue. So I think lotteries, board governance, those were probably some big operational pieces. You know, and then funding, you know, especially as dollars started to come open from the CARES Act for, you know, the PPP money, the CARES Act funding, schools trying to turn quickly to apply for those funds, figure out what they're going to do with them. So those were some of the, I think those were some of the operational topics that I saw.
I will also, one operational topic was the building and the access to the building. You know, there was lots of statutes going on with the COVID situation that buildings in statewide was not accessible. So we were trying to figure out and navigate what that looks like for staff, and not necessarily for students, but mostly for staff as they wanted to go and pick up things and their personal items and as such. So we had students who, because we abruptly went into e-learning, they had things that they had left in the building that they wanted. We had parents who were yelling and saying, hey, you know, my kid has a $200 jacket, you know, in the building, and I'm wondering if I can go get it. I don't want anybody to take it. So the building issue also was something of the sort that we had to work out.
That's a really good point. We tried to send a staff member in our office to our building on campus, and she realized that the building was padlocked. we didn't know, you know, and you had to sign up for like a 15-minute time slot to be able to go into the building and be escorted in by security. So it's a whole ordeal that, you know, none of us really anticipated. But I think that schools did a really good job too of trying to schedule the drop, you know, picking up, scheduling people to pick up their stuff from their locker for, you know, for kids. So I know that was a whole ordeal for schools to coordinate.
Yeah, and I echo that as well. We having 15 locations across the state, and having Monroe County, Howard County be more progressive in terms of closing things down before the governor shut everything down. The health department out in Wayne County shut our Richmond school down before the governor did. We are co-located with a post-secondary institution. They shut their building before the governor did. And so now I think we're going to see the reverse of that. As the state opens up, these counties will be slower to open up, or the university will be slower to open up. And we're going to have to navigate that as a network where we have 5 fully going, 4 slow, 3 closed. We're just going to have to see how this unfolds, of course. But that's more of a normal reality that we've all been looking at the last couple of weeks versus when everybody was scrambling to figure out how to do it.
I would loop back to one piece also with the technology for as far as operations and access to technology is one thing we hadn't done before because our schools aren't one-to-one. And so we typically, when students enroll, we don't ask them about their technology access because it's not necessary in the same way as some models are. And so that was one thing that we realized. You never know what information you're going to need until you need it. And so we were really quickly able to turn around a student survey to see what level of technology they already had access to as we were thinking about with the shift to e-learning. And so in creating different tiers of access, we could then survey students really quickly through you know, a texting survey as far as what level they had. And then by putting students in those tiers, we were actually able to really deploy a great deal of technology very quickly to the students who needed it most. And so that was one thing also that we hadn't considered before. Similarly, we have the opportunity to use, you know, student email addresses, especially for IndyMet with minors. And we hadn't used that as much because our students, again, face-to-face, So we hadn't thought of it in the same way. And so now that was also an aha for us to make sure that we are sending out emails to students on a somewhat consistent basis moving forward, so that students, whether we're under COVID or not, so that students know to check their school-based email on a regular basis, just as a good method for communication, so that when something like this happens, hopefully it doesn't ever happen again, right? We don't ever want to find ourselves in a pandemic again, but if we do, or there's some other situation that comes up, students know, oh, if I check my school email, I can get any information that I need in a timely manner. So those were things for us that we hadn't thought about before because of our models, but then through COVID and not being face-to-face, they were things that we were able to identify and pivot to quickly. So if that's helpful to others as you think about, as you move forward, just ways to communicate with folks and ways to make sure students have whatever technology they need if you're not a one-to-one school.
And I think the last thing I will talk through, because thank you, Ann, that brought up some components that we haven't thought through. We just now starting is the training of the technology. And so whatever that looks like for your staff, because you have to look at your staff, and if they're able to utilize the programming that you have for your model in this environment now, because you never know when your school is going to close, if it has to, based off the year. So just making sure your staff is trained, but most importantly, making sure that our students are trained on, one, the technology, and then how to utilize and navigate through that and get connected with the people that they need to get connected with.
I want to encourage anyone to type any last minute questions or thoughts they have to share. I want to thank our panelists so much for sharing their time and their really, really thoughtful reflections on the past few months. I made the offer in the previous panel that was talking about forward-looking operations to gather anyone who's interested in the future to continue to have chats like this, leaders to leaders. And I'd be thrilled to facilitate that. If anybody's interested, please feel free to let me know if there's specific topics that you're interested in. Thank you again for participating, those of you who were with us last week, for those of us who are with us all morning today. I really, really hope that this has helped in you just to download all the things that have been swirling around your brain these last few months and hopefully put them into some sort of order that you can use productively moving forward. Any further ways that ICSN can help you do that as we keep going forward, please don't hesitate to let me know. So with that, I'll say thank you all again and have a great rest of the day and a great week and a good summer.